Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever watched something on a security camera and wondered if what you saw was real? What if, one night, you saw something that shouldn't have been there, something that felt too close to home? Something that made you question not only the camera, but your own mind? It was one of those late nights. The kind where the clock ticks so slowly that each passing second feels like an hour. I had been working as a night security guard at the old office building for almost 6 months. The place was quiet, too quiet most nights, and I had gotten used to the routine. The building was old, a relic from another era. The halls echoed with each step, and the fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly above. My job was simple: check the cameras, walk the halls, ensure everything was locked, and wait until morning. It was the kind of job that let me think, but also left my mind to wander in the silence of the night. The cameras were my constant companions. Each monitor in the security room displayed the building from every angle. A grainy black and white view of the halls, stairways, and entrances. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I didn't mind the quiet. Most nights, the footage was uneventful. Just the occasional flicker of a shadow or a hallway light turning off on its own, which was easily explained. The building was old, after all. Sometimes wires misfired. Sometimes, I misheard things. It happened. That night, though, was different. I had just finished my rounds and returned to the security room. The dimly lit space felt colder than usual. The hum of the monitors filled the room as I took my seat, but the feeling of something off lingered in the air. I began to scroll through the camera feeds, checking the usual spots. Everything seemed fine until I reached the feed for the 4th floor. There was something wrong with it. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. The picture was a little too fuzzy, but as I zoomed in, I saw it clearly. There, in the center of the empty corridor, was a shadow. A long, tall shape that stretched down the hallway, flickering in and out like a malfunctioning projection. It didn't belong there. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was always empty at this time of night, always. I had just walked through it myself. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, its shape unnaturally still. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it as another glitch, something shifted. It grew longer. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the creeping unease that settled over me. I had to be seeing things. It was just the angle of the light, the weird glitch in the camera. I was tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, the figure moved again. Slowly, it seemed to stretch, as if growing larger in the frame. I sat back, my stomach twisting. My hand hovered over the monitor. This wasn't normal. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was a shape. A shape that seemed far too familiar. I looked again, blinking rapidly, trying to make sense of it. And then it hit me. It was my shadow. But it couldn't be. I was sitting in the security room, watching the feed. There was no way that my shadow could stretch across the 4th floor hallway like that. I hadn't even been near the hallway in the last half hour. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. I rewound the footage, replaying it back from the beginning, trying to find any explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe the building had a weird structural anomaly that caused the shadow to shift like that. I had to be imagining things. But no matter how many times I watched it, the shadow didn't change. I stopped the footage. It was still there, hovering in the middle of the hallway, growing taller and stretching further down the corridor. My hands began to sweat. I couldn't look away. I had to know more. What was it? Why was it there? And why did it look like it was moving closer to the camera? Closer to me? I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. It was real. That shape, that shadow, it wasn't a glitch. It was following me. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thickening with dread. I had to do something. I couldn't sit here and watch anymore. But I couldn't stop either. I reached for the walkie-talkie on the desk and pressed the button. Hello? My voice cracked. Anyone on the line? There was no response. The building was completely silent, except for the buzz of the lights overhead. I swallowed hard and glanced back at the screen. The shadow was gone. It had disappeared from the monitor, leaving the hallway empty again. But I knew it wasn't gone. I felt it. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The building was eerily silent now, the air thick with anticipation. I had to check. I had to go to that hallway. With every step, my thoughts raced. What if I wasn't alone in the building? What if something was watching me? I grabbed my flashlight, feeling the weight of it in my hand. The cold metal felt like the only thing grounding me to reality as I made my way toward the door. I had to face whatever was there. I opened the door to the hallway, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. The floor creaked beneath my boots, echoing in the empty space. The shadow, was it still there? I held my breath and turned the corner. The hallway was dark, stretching out in front of me like a tunnel, but there was nothing there. No shadow. No figure. I exhaled, almost relieved, but the feeling didn't fade. Something was wrong. I could still feel it, watching. Then, I heard it. A faint rustling behind me. Footsteps. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the hum of the lights and the unsettling silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that whatever I had seen on the monitor had seen me too. And now, it was waiting. I stood frozen in the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound of footsteps, where had they come from? I turned slowly, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The hall seemed endless, stretching further than it should have, the walls closing in around me. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I had to move. I had to get out of here. But every step felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't understand, something that didn't belong. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam wavered. I swung it back and forth, trying to steady my nerves. The hallway remained empty, silent. But I knew better than to trust my own mind right now. It was like my body was telling me to run, but my feet refused to move. I was hearing things. That's what I told myself. A building this old, this empty, played tricks on you. The pipes groaned, the wires hummed, the floors creaked. Of course, the sound of footsteps could have just been the wind. Or the old air vents. Anything. I took a step forward, moving cautiously. The door to the stairwell was just a few feet away. Once I reached it, I could get to the lobby and everything would be fine. The night guard from the front desk would still be awake and I could tell him about the glitch on the camera. But as I walked, the floor creaked underfoot, too loudly, too much. I stopped. I could hear it clearer now, the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. It was closer this time. I swung the flashlight around, casting the beam over the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. I froze again, straining to hear any further movement. But there was only silence, and that silence felt like it was pressing against me, closing in from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And then, there it was again. The sound of the footsteps. But they weren't coming from the floor. They were coming from behind me, echoing from the shadows just out of sight. I turned on my heels, but nothing was there. The beam of the flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely. I cursed under my breath and frantically clicked the switch, trying to turn it back on. But it was useless. The light had failed. I swallowed hard. Now, I was truly alone in the dark. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. Soft, but unmistakable. "Why are you running?" The voice was low, gravelly, like it had been dragged through years of dust and decay. It echoed off the walls, surrounding me, coming from all directions at once. I couldn't breathe. My throat constricted, and I felt an icy chill creep over my skin. I turned again, hoping to catch sight of the source of that voice, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow. Just the endless corridor stretching out before me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to get back to the security room. I had to get to the cameras. But as I started to walk toward the stairs again, the footsteps resumed. And this time, they were unmistakably real. Closer. Closer. The sound of boots against the floor was louder now, each step more pronounced than the last. It was like someone was following me, someone who knew exactly where I was going. I glanced behind me, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the door to the stairwell slammed shut. The bang was deafening, echoing down the hall like the building itself had just taken a breath. I froze again. The footsteps had stopped. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just an accident. But I knew deep down, nothing in this building was an accident tonight. Something had been waiting for me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the door handle. I pushed it open slowly, careful not to make a sound. But the door creaked loudly in protest. And there it was. In the corner of my vision, a figure stood. A man, or maybe something like a man. He was tall, hunched, with long limbs and no distinct features, just a silhouette against the dim light. His face was obscured in shadow, but his presence, it felt wrong. The figure didn't move. He simply stood there, watching me. The air around me seemed to freeze. Time stretched. My body didn't want to respond. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. Then it spoke again. "Why do you watch?" the voice whispered, more forceful this time. I couldn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering me. Then, in one smooth motion, it stepped forward, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. I didn't wait for it to reappear. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I sprinted back toward the security room. Every door, every corner felt like it was closing in on me. The building felt alive, like it was shifting around me, reacting to my every move. I reached the security room and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed the monitors, flipping through the cameras one by one. The hallways were empty, just as I had expected. But as I scanned the feeds, I noticed something. There, on the fourth floor camera, the shadow was back. And this time, it was not alone. It was joined by another figure, one that looked far too much like me. The camera feed flickered again, distorting the image, but there was no mistaking it. That shadow, it was me. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow on the camera wasn't just a glitch. It was a figure, standing just like me, as if it were waiting for something. Waiting for me. The room seemed to grow colder, the silence becoming more oppressive. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The figure, my shadow, moved. Not like a person would move, but in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet on invisible strings. It was mimicking me, but in ways that weren't right. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. My fingers were frozen to the buttons on the security console, as if the system itself had bound me here, forced me to watch, to witness whatever this was. I toggled between cameras, desperately searching for some explanation. The hallway on the fourth floor was empty. No one else was there. The shadow was alone. But it wasn't. I could feel it. It was watching me. I leaned closer to the screen. The figure on the camera stood perfectly still for a moment. Then, as if reacting to my gaze, it turned. Slowly. Its head tilted up, directly toward the camera, as though it could see me, too. A chill shot up my spine. The shadow lifted one arm and pointed directly at the camera. I recoiled, stumbling back from the console. My breath caught in my throat. The figure on the screen remained motionless, its pointed finger a silent, accusing gesture. But I knew, somehow, I just knew that it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something real. Something alive. The lights in the security room flickered, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing louder. My pulse raced, my mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the screen, from the camera itself. But no, this sound was coming from outside the room. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest. The door to the security room was still locked. I had checked it twice. But the tapping was there, a rhythmic, almost deliberate knock against the metal. Tap. 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 I walked slowly toward the door, my body tense, my feet moving of their own accord. I knew I shouldn't open it. But I had to. Something in me demanded that I know what was on the other side. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The tap stopped the instant my fingers touched the cold metal. I hesitated. Was it a person? Was someone playing a sick joke on me? No. I didn't believe that anymore. I slowly pulled the door open. Empty. The hallway stretched out before me, as lifeless as it had been before. Nothing was there. But the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The silence was too complete. And then, as I stood there in the doorway, the lights above me flickered once again. A shadow shifted across the floor. I blinked, but when I looked down, it was gone. I slammed the door shut, locking it again, my hands still trembling. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from this place. I turned back to the monitors. I couldn't stop myself from looking at the feed again, even though I knew it would only make things worse. The figure on the fourth floor camera was still there. It hadn't moved, but something about it was different. It was closer now. The distance between it and the camera had shortened, but it wasn't just closer physically. It felt closer to me, too. It felt like it was right behind me, like I could feel its presence breathing down my neck. I spun around, my pulse racing. The room was empty. Nothing. No one. But then, I saw it, just for a second, something that shouldn't have been there. A reflection in the dark window. There, standing just behind me, in the shadows, was the same figure. My own reflection, but distorted, twisted, like it wasn't quite my own. It didn't match my movements. It moved slowly, like it was dragging itself toward me. I backed away from the monitors, my legs shaking, my head spinning. The room felt too small, too suffocating. And then, in the reflection, it smiled. A wide, unnaturally long grin stretched across its face. It wasn't my reflection anymore. It was something else. I stumbled back into the chair, trying to regain control of my breathing. I couldn't think straight. I had to focus. I had to keep my head together. The shadow, it was part of the building, part of the system. A glitch, a malfunction. That was all. But as I looked back at the camera feed, I realized something that made my stomach churn. The figure wasn't a glitch. The figure was in the hallway now. It wasn't just a shadow. It was moving. It was coming for me. I reached for the alarm button, my fingers numb, but it was too late. The lights in the security room flickered once more, and then they went out entirely. I was plunged into darkness, and in the pitch-black silence, I heard it. A whisper. "Why are you watching me?" And then the door to the security room slammed open, the sound deafening. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The shadow was already there. The darkness engulfed me. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud it almost drowned out the sound of my own breath. I could feel the presence, thick and suffocating, just beyond my sight. The door had slammed open, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I was rooted in place, frozen in terror. Then, that whisper came again, closer this time, like it was right behind me. "Why are you watching me?" I didn't know how to answer. How could I? What could I say to something like this? I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but my body refused to obey. Every muscle in my body locked, as though the fear itself had taken control of me. I didn't dare move, not even a muscle. I could feel the air change, colder, heavier, as though the very space around me was warping. The whispers grew louder, multiplying. Now there were more of them, all at once, surrounding me from all directions. "Why are you still watching?" they asked, each voice overlapping, distorting. "Why do you follow me?" I clenched my fists, willing myself to move, but my body betrayed me. My eyes were glued to the empty space in front of me. I could feel the figures, closing in, circling me, as though waiting for me to do something, anything. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke through the chaos. A scratching sound, slow and deliberate. It came from the wall beside me, a dragging, scraping noise like claws on metal. My head snapped toward the sound, my eyes searching in the dark, but I saw nothing. "You're not supposed to be here." I jumped, a violent shudder running through me as the voice sounded right in my ear. I whirled around, but the room was still empty. The sound of the scraping continued, now shifting to the floor, closer and closer. Whatever was in here was playing with me, toying with my fear. I closed my eyes for a brief second, trying to steady myself. I had to focus. I had to get control. I couldn't let these things, break me. They were just shadows, just echoes. There was an explanation. There had to be. But as I opened my eyes, I saw it again. No, I felt it. The cold touch on the back of my neck. A chill so deep it felt like it was digging into my bones. I could feel its fingers, its presence just behind me, hovering. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I spun toward the console, desperate to see something, anything, that would make sense of this madness. I quickly hit the power button, but nothing happened. The screen remained black. The room was still suffocating, the shadows too heavy to ignore. Then, a voice spoke, so close, so clear that it felt like it was coming from within me. "You're not the one who watches anymore." Before I could process the words, the lights flickered back to life. The room flooded with harsh, fluorescent light, but the atmosphere remained suffocating. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. And then I saw it. On the monitor, the hallway camera was still active. The feed was shaky, distorted, but I could see the shape. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, just as it had done before, but now it was clearer. The shadow from before had grown more distinct, no longer just a vague silhouette, it had form. A figure, almost human in shape, tall and gaunt. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisting in ways they shouldn't have, but what caught my attention most were its eyes, black pits, empty and endless, staring directly into the camera. And then it stepped forward. Closer. Closer. It was no longer just on the screen. The figure had crossed over. It was here. The room seemed to distort around me as the lights flickered again, the hum of the electricity growing louder, more oppressive. The walls seemed to bend, shift, like they were pulling in toward me. I could feel the weight of it all. The pressure in the room. The shadow was here, standing in front of me now. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure was inches from me. I could feel its breath, cold and foul, brushing against my face. "Why are you watching me?" it whispered again. But this time, the voice was no longer distorted. It was mine. The realization hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of my lungs. My eyes widened as I slowly turned toward the console. The reflection on the screen, it was me. But it wasn't me. It was something else. I watched as my reflection, my twisted, distorted reflection, smiled back at me from the monitor. Its eyes were empty, hollow, and in its hands it held a familiar object. A flashlight. The same flashlight I had been holding when the lights went out. The shadow raised the flashlight slowly, its fingers curling around it in an unnatural way. "You're the one who's been watching me," it said, its voice now completely mine, only colder, more hollow. "Now it's my turn." The screen flickered violently, the image distorting, twisting as the shadow in the hallway took one final step forward, right into the camera, right into me. And then, the lights went out again. The silence was deafening. I was no longer alone. I gasped for breath, heart pounding in my chest, but it felt as though the air itself had thickened, making each inhale a struggle. The room was plunged into darkness again, but I couldn't tell if my eyes were still adjusting or if the shadows had taken hold, warping my perception. I reached out, my hands trembling, trying to find something, anything, to anchor me. The cold walls pressed against my fingers as though they were closing in, their smooth surface becoming jagged and oppressive. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't see, but I could feel the presence, a weight in the air that was all too familiar now. Then, I heard it again. That whisper. It was different this time, though. It wasn't the voice of the figure. It wasn't even my own voice. It was a low, guttural hum, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the very walls themselves. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Am I losing my mind? I thought. Am I hallucinating? The sound shifted, morphing into something more distinct, a slow scraping noise, like nails dragging across the floorboards. My eyes squeezed shut, but I couldn't block it out. The noise was getting closer. I could feel the vibrations beneath my feet, could hear the rhythm of the scrape, like something was crawling toward me from the corners of the room. I forced my eyes open, and in that instant, I saw something. A movement. A shadow. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. The shape was tall, almost unnaturally so, and it was standing in the far corner of the room, just at the edge of the darkness. I couldn't make out details, only the outline of a figure that seemed to distort with every flicker of light. It was watching me. And then I realized. It wasn't the figure from the camera feed anymore. It was something worse, something far more sinister. I froze. My body refused to move, but my mind raced, running through every possibility. I was suffocating in fear, knowing that this was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was a hunt. A game I hadn't been prepared for. The scrape of claws on the floor grew louder. Closer. Until I felt a sudden, icy breath on the back of my neck. My skin crawled. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, nothing visible. The room was still empty, save for the dim flicker of the emergency lights on the walls. But the presence remained, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. It's not real, I told myself, my hands clutching at my head. It can't be real. This is just a malfunction. A trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just a glitch or a strange moment of imagination. The thing, the shadow, the thing that had been in the camera feed, the thing that had been in the hallway, was here. The lights flickered again, and I caught another glimpse of it, clearer this time. The figure was no longer just standing. It was moving. Slowly, steadily, as if drawn toward me. It stepped forward, its outline becoming more defined, sharper. And I saw its face. Or rather, what should have been its face. It was a blank, smooth expanse of pale skin, like a mask with no features. No eyes. No mouth. Just an empty surface where a human face should be. The longer I stared, the more the air around it seemed to warp, to stretch, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under its presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare, frozen, as the figure came closer, step by step. And then it stopped. Right in front of me. It was no longer a shadow. It was standing there, so close I could feel the chill radiating off of it. The air was thick with its presence, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my own shallow breaths, each one feeling like a struggle against the pressure of the room. "You've been watching," it said, its voice a low rasp that seemed to reverberate inside my skull. I swallowed hard, trying to form words, but my mouth was dry. Why are you doing this?" I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. It didn't speak again. Instead, it reached out. Its hand was long, unnaturally long, the fingers stretching far beyond what was humanly possible. Each finger moved with eerie precision, reaching toward me with deliberate slowness. I couldn't pull away. My body refused to react, as if I was paralyzed by the sight of this grotesque hand reaching for me. Just as it touched my shoulder, the lights flickered once more. This time, they went out completely. The darkness was suffocating. But then, something changed. The sensation of the hand on my shoulder disappeared, replaced by a sharp, biting cold that seemed to come from within my own skin. I jerked back, startled, and opened my eyes. The room was silent. Completely still. I stood alone. The figure was gone. But the camera feed was still active. And as I glanced at the screen, I saw it. The image of the empty hallway. Was it empty, though? My reflection. Standing right behind me. And I realized, too late, that I hadn't been watching it all along. It had been watching me. It all started with a question that I still can't answer. "Are you ready?" the driver asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the street as I got into the taxi. He knew my name, and the words felt like an electric shock that ran through me. How could he know? I hadn't even told him yet. It didn't make sense, but I just nodded, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping up my spine. The car smelled old, like leather and dust, but in a way that made it feel oddly familiar. The seats were worn, the kind of worn that only time could leave behind. Outside, the world was a blur, city lights flashing by as we drove, but there was something unsettling about the stillness that wrapped around the car. The streets were emptier than usual, and the sounds that usually filled the night seemed distant, as though muffled by a thick fog that had no place in the city. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He didn't look at me as he spoke, but his voice, low, almost whispering, seemed to reach me from every corner of the car. "You know," he began, "it's funny how time works. One minute you're driving down the same street every day, and the next, you find yourself in a place you never thought you'd be." I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the growing unease. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I regretted it almost immediately. His response was slow, deliberate, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I remember a time when this city was full of life. But then, things changed." He let the sentence hang in the air, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint rustle, like something moving just beyond the reach of my eyes. I glanced out the window, but the streets were empty. There was nothing there. "Things change?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the answer. The taxi turned onto a narrow road, one I didn't recognize. I looked out the window again, but the buildings looked strange. They were there, but not quite right. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something move in them. Something human? The driver didn't break his quiet, unblinking stare at the road. "Yes," he replied. "Sometimes, people go missing. And sometimes they come back. But they're never quite the same. His words sent a chill down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to speak, trying to keep my voice steady. What do you mean by never quite the same? The driver finally glanced at me, his eyes cold and distant. Sometimes they remember things they shouldn't. And sometimes they forget things they should never forget. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words got stuck. The car seemed to slow, and the night air, which had once been crisp and cool, now felt suffocating, thick, and heavy. I looked ahead, but I could no longer see the city. The streets had disappeared, replaced by a dark, endless road that stretched into nothingness. Where are we going? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. The question sounded stupid as soon as it left my lips. But the driver's eyes flickered toward me again, his lips curling into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. To a place that doesn't exist, he said softly. And then, without warning, the world outside the car seemed to shift. The streetlights blinked out, one by one, leaving the road in complete darkness. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound, a sound that now felt wrong. The air inside the car grew heavier, and I could feel something pressing against me, as if the walls of the car itself were closing in. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, but it was there, in the pit of my stomach. "You're not really here, are you?" the driver asked suddenly, his voice low and distant. I turned to look at him, but his face, it wasn't his face anymore. It was blurry, shifting, like a reflection in water. My heart raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't answer. What could I say? The driver turned the wheel sharply, and the car jerked to the side. The world outside seemed to warp, the road twisting, the trees bending, the buildings melting into something that shouldn't be possible. And then, silence. The taxi stopped, and I realized we were no longer on a street, but in a vast, empty space. There were no lights, no signs, no landmarks. Just a never-ending stretch of darkness. "Get out," the driver said softly, his voice no longer sounding human. I opened the door, my legs trembling beneath me as I stepped onto the ground. The air felt thick and wrong, like I was breathing in something that wasn't meant to be breathed. "Where am I?" I asked, but there was no answer. The driver was gone. The world around me seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against me from every side. The road I had traveled down had disappeared, and I was left in a place that didn't exist. Was it a dream? A nightmare? I didn't know. But I was alone. Alone in a place that had no name, no time, no history. And somewhere, in the distance, I thought I heard something. Footsteps? Or something worse? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but when I looked down at my watch, only a few minutes had passed. Time had stopped. It couldn't be real. How could it be real? The darkness surrounding me was so complete, so all-encompassing, that it seemed to swallow any trace of the world I had come from. The taxi, the city, the driver, all of it was gone. Just the road beneath my feet and the empty stretch of nothingness ahead. I could feel my pulse thudding in my temples, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. "Stay calm. Stay calm," I repeated to myself like a mantra. But how could I? There was no rational explanation for this. No way to understand what had happened. The air tasted wrong, thick with the feeling of something out of place, something unnatural. I took a step forward, my feet crunching against the gravel-like surface beneath me. The sound felt too loud, too sharp in the eerie silence that stretched around me. I looked behind me, but there was nothing but the endless stretch of darkness. I turned back to face what lay ahead, my eyes straining to see past the thick fog that had begun to settle. I didn't know why I started walking. Maybe I hoped that if I kept moving, I would eventually find something, anything familiar. Or maybe I was trying to outrun whatever had happened, as if running could solve a puzzle that had no answer. But with each step, the silence grew heavier. The air seemed to press down on me, suffocating. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A faint whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, soft and distant, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, expecting to see something, someone. But there was nothing. Only the blackness, stretching infinitely. The whisper came again, closer this time, sharper, like it was right next to my ear. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I froze, unable to move. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was like a memory, just out of reach. I strained to hear, to make sense of it, but the words were broken, fragmented. "You should not have come," it said. The voice was cold, lifeless, and as soon as it faded, I felt a chill run through my body. My breath caught in my throat. Should not have come? What did that mean? Why was it saying that? I looked around, my pulse pounding in my ears, but still, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged in the stillness. I turned back toward the road ahead and began walking faster, my steps quickening, as though moving would somehow keep the fear at bay. But the fear wasn't just in my mind. It was in the air, in the very ground beneath my feet. It clung to me like a second skin. The road seemed endless. No end in sight, just more of the same dark emptiness. And then, ahead, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, but as I got closer, I could make out the shape of a person standing motionless in the middle of the road. My heart lurched, and I stopped, frozen in place. It was a man, tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his back to me. The way he stood, still and unmoving, was unnatural. I took a cautious step forward, then another, unsure if I should approach or run. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin, as if the silence around me swallowed it before it could reach him. The man didn't respond. His figure remained a silhouette against the darkness, his shoulders broad, his stance rigid. There was something wrong about him, something that made my skin crawl. His presence was oppressive, heavy, like an anchor in the middle of this empty void. I tried again. "Excuse me. Can you help me?" The man shifted slightly, and for the first time, I saw his face, though it was only for a split second. His features were indistinct, blurry, as though they were caught in a smear of oil. But there was something about his eyes. Something cold, something knowing. They locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt as though he could see straight through me. Into my very soul. Without a word, he turned and began walking down the road, his steps slow and deliberate. Every step he took was a heavy thud, echoing in the silence, each footfall like a warning. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, my body frozen in place. But then, as if against my will, my legs moved. I took a few steps forward, hesitant at first, but the figure didn't stop, didn't even glance back. It was as if he were leading me somewhere. I didn't know why I followed him, but I did. Each step brought me deeper into this strange world, deeper into a place that shouldn't exist. The man ahead of me continued to walk, his back still turned, his figure becoming more and more distant with every step I took. Suddenly, the air shifted again. The sound of the man's footsteps, once so clear, began to distort. It was as if they were echoing in a tunnel, stretching out, becoming louder and faster. I looked down at my feet, then up at him again. He was still walking, but now his pace was quicker, more urgent. I started running, my breath ragged, desperate to catch up with him. But the faster I ran, the further away he seemed. It was as though I were running in place, trapped in a loop, unable to reach him. And then, in an instant, he was gone. I stopped, panting, my heart racing. The road was empty once again. The man, the footsteps, everything had disappeared as if it had never been there. And then, from somewhere far off, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, clearer. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, but there was no one. Just the darkness. I was completely alone. The words echoed in my ears, their coldness wrapping around me like a vice. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was so clear now, so definite. It felt like a warning, but from what? And who? I spun around again, my breath coming faster now, heart racing. The darkness felt closer, as if it were pressing in from every angle. The world had gone silent again, eerily, suffocatingly silent. No more footsteps, no whispers, just the oppressive weight of an endless void surrounding me. I looked down the road. The shadow of the man had vanished, but the road itself seemed different now, distorted, warped. The gravel beneath my feet was softer, almost like sand, and the edges of the road were blurred, shifting like a mirage. The air was thick, heavy, and the farther I looked ahead, the more the road seemed to stretch into infinity, like it had no end, no beginning. Just an endless cycle. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find my way out, but there was nowhere to go. The road had become a labyrinth, a trap with no escape. The darkness seemed to breathe with me, alive in its own way, pressing in on me with every passing second. I started walking again, but my steps felt like they were dragging through molasses. My feet were heavy, reluctant to move forward, but my body had no choice. I kept walking, each step feeling like an eternity, and still, there was no end to this road. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. Hours? Days? Time had become irrelevant in this strange place. And then, through the fog, I saw something. A light. It flickered in the distance, small and weak, like the glow of a distant lantern. It was the first sign of life I had seen since I had arrived. A light meant people. A way out. A sense of direction. I ran toward it, desperation driving me forward. The air around me seemed to shift with every step, becoming heavier, as though I were sinking deeper into something. But the light was still there, a flicker in the distance, unwavering. I pushed harder, my breath coming in gasps, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach it. The closer I got, the more the light seemed to grow. It became brighter, clearer, and as it did, I could hear something faint but unmistakable. A voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. But there was something off about it. Something wrong. The words she spoke were unrecognizable, as if they were not in any language I knew. I tried to make sense of them, to piece them together, but the more I tried, the more they slipped away from me. It was as if the words themselves were being erased as soon as they were formed. And then, finally, I reached the light. It wasn't a lantern, as I had thought, but a doorway. A doorway that led into nothing. The light poured from it, but the space beyond was empty, black. I stood there, staring at it, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. The light had seemed so real, so tangible. Yet now it was just a door into the void. I reached out, trembling, and my hand brushed the edge of the doorway. The moment my fingers made contact, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock running through my body. A searing pain shot up my arm, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Something about the door held me there, like it was pulling me in. I looked back at the road, but there was nothing now, no path, no escape, just the dark, oppressive void that surrounded me. I felt it then, the presence. The feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but all I saw was darkness. Yet I knew. I felt it. And then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. But they weren't my own. They were close, closer than I wanted them to be. I could feel them now, not just in the air, but in the ground beneath me, vibrating through my bones. I turned again, and there, just beyond the edge of the doorway, was the figure. The man. He stood there, silent and still, just like before. His features were even more distorted now, his face a blur of shifting shadows. But his eyes were the same. Cold, knowing, and locked on mine. Without a word, he stepped forward, and the air seemed to ripple with his movement. The ground beneath me shuddered, and the world tilted slightly, as though gravity itself was shifting. I took a step back, instinctively, but I didn't move fast enough. The man was there in front of me now, his figure looming over me. His shadow stretched across the road, and I could feel it press against me like a weight. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice a low growl, and though his lips barely moved, I could hear the words clearly, like they were right in my ear. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, to demand an explanation, but my mouth wouldn't move. My body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in this endless cycle, this place that shouldn't exist. The man reached out, his hand cold as ice, and his fingers brushed against my cheek. I flinched, but there was nowhere to go. "You belong to this place now," he whispered, his voice echoing in my head, not just in my ears. "And it will never let you leave." The world around me began to darken even further, the shadows closing in, pulling me into them. And just before the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard that same voice again, clearer now than ever before. "You're not supposed to be here." The darkness was consuming me, but it wasn't like before. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, heavy and suffocating. It surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, until I could feel my chest tightening, my lungs gasping for air that wasn't there. The world was slipping away, twisting, contorting into something unrecognizable, and yet I could still hear it. That voice. "You belong here now," it repeated, but this time there was something else in it, something mocking, as if it was laughing at me, at my fear. The man's touch lingered on my cheek, cold and unnatural, and I could feel the chill seeping into my skin, into my bones. The world spun around me, faster and faster, until the ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. I stumbled, my body weightless, falling through nothing. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the spinning stopped. I was standing again, though I wasn't sure where. The darkness had receded slightly, replaced by an eerie, dim glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The road was still there, but it was different now, warped like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The edges of the road were jagged, the air thick with the scent of decay. I blinked, trying to adjust to my surroundings, but the world felt wrong. The shapes that were supposed to be familiar, the trees, the buildings, the distant horizon, were all twisted, distorted. Everything was off kilter, as though reality itself was slowly unraveling. And then, through the haze, I saw something, someone. A woman, standing in the distance. She was small, hunched over, her hands trembling as if she were caught in the same grip of terror I felt. She didn't move, just stared ahead, her face obscured by the shadows. I wanted to call out to her, to ask if she knew what was happening, but my voice wouldn't come. I took a step forward, then another, drawn toward her, as if by some invisible force. With every step I took, I could feel the weight of the place pressing on me more, like the world itself was closing around me. When I was close enough, I stopped. She hadn't moved. She was still staring into the distance, her face pale and gaunt. I couldn't see her eyes, but there was something haunting about the way she stood, like she was waiting for something or someone. "Are you okay?" I managed to whisper, the words barely audible, but she didn't respond. I took another step closer, but just before I reached her, the woman's head turned sharply toward me. Her eyes were wide, glassy, empty. "Don't," she said, her voice cracked like it hadn't been used in years. "Don't follow him." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Follow him? Who was she talking about? But before I could ask, her hand shot out, grasping my arm with a force that felt unnatural, as if she were holding me in place with some unseen power. Her grip was cold, colder than anything I had felt before, and I felt the shock of it travel up my arm. I tried to pull away, but it was impossible. She held me there, her fingers digging into my skin. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered again, her voice low and urgent. "This place, it changes you. Once you're here, you can never leave." "Not really." I tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. The fear I had felt before was nothing compared to the overwhelming dread that now gripped me. There was something about her warning that felt real. And then I felt it again, the presence. The man. His footsteps were approaching, slow and deliberate. I could hear them in the distance, echoing through the void. The woman's grip tightened, and she pulled me closer to her, as if trying to shield me from whatever was coming. "Don't let him take you," she begged, her voice trembling. "If you do, you'll be like him. Trapped. Lost forever." But it was too late. The man stepped into view, his form tall and imposing, his shadow stretching across the road like a dark cloud. His eyes locked onto mine again, and this time, I didn't just see coldness in them, I saw something darker. Something ancient. "You're already too far gone," he said, his voice like a low growl reverberating through my chest. "You've made your choice." I tried to back away, to run, but the woman's grip kept me rooted to the spot. The road around me seemed to shift, to distort, and I realized with growing horror that I wasn't even standing on solid ground anymore. The road beneath my feet was no longer gravel, but a swirling vortex, like liquid night, pulling me down. I looked at the woman, her face twisted in fear, her hands shaking. "Help me!" I cried out, but the words barely left my mouth before she let go of my arm. "No one can help you now," she whispered, her voice distant, almost resigned. Not even you. With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there alone. The man's figure loomed closer. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and I felt the coldness of his gaze seeping into me, suffocating me from the inside. I could hear his footsteps now, louder, closer, and before I could move, he was standing right in front of me. "You can't escape this place," he said, his voice like a curse. "It's part of you now, and it always will be." I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, like the road itself was holding me in place. The darkness around me thickened, and I could feel it closing in. The air was colder, thinner, and the only sound was the rhythmic beating of my heart, faster now, desperate. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a flicker of light. It wasn't bright, but it was there, and it beckoned to me. It was the only thing that felt real in this place, and instinctively, I knew I had to reach it. I had to escape. I tried to move again, but the man's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. His grip was iron, unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dark, final. The light in the distance flickered once more. But I didn't have much time left. The grip on my wrist tightened as if the man's hand were made of stone. His fingers dug into my skin, and with each passing second, I could feel the darkness swallowing me whole. The coldness of his touch spread up my arm, through my chest, and into my very soul. It was as if he were draining everything out of me, the warmth, the life, the will to resist. I tried to pull away, but it was useless. My body was frozen in place, caught in his unyielding grasp. The light in the distance flickered again, this time brighter, clearer. It pulsed with an energy that felt almost alive, and in that moment, I knew that I had a choice. A final choice. "Please," I whispered, though the word barely escaped my lips. My voice felt foreign, weak. "Let me go. I need to go to the light." The man's expression didn't change. His eyes, those cold, knowing eyes, were locked onto mine, and I saw something else in them now, something ancient, something final. "You are the light now," he said, his voice low, steady, almost pitying. "You are part of this place. There is no escaping it. There never was." But even as his words sunk in, I could still see it. The light. It was more than just a flicker now, it was almost blinding, pulsing with energy, like a heartbeat. It was my way out. I felt it in my very bones. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I felt the tug of the light pulling me, urging me toward it. Every fiber of my being screamed to move, to break free. But the man's hand held me fast, a vice that wouldn't loosen, and his grip felt like a chain wrapping itself around me, tying me to this place. "You will never leave," he repeated, his voice like ice. "This is your home now." I looked down at my feet, the road beneath me shifting again, warping like a reflection in a puddle. The darkness crept in, crawling at the edges of my vision, but the light was still there, still shining in the distance, beckoning me. And then, I remembered her, the woman. The one who had warned me. She had tried to stop me, to save me, but I hadn't listened. I had followed the man. I had followed the road. Was it too late now? Was I already lost? The man stepped closer, his face looming above mine, his presence overwhelming. His breath was cold against my skin. "It's too late for you." "No," I said, though my voice was trembling, barely audible. "I'm not staying here." The light pulsed again, brighter than before, and this time I knew I had to make a choice. There was no more time to think, no more time to doubt. I had to act, or I would be trapped here forever, like the others. Like the woman who had vanished into the shadows. Like the man who had been waiting for me. I forced my legs to move, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I tore my arm away from the man's grip. It burned, but I didn't stop. I pushed past the pain, the fear, everything that had been holding me back. I turned toward the light and ran. My legs moved faster than they had ever moved before, and as I sprinted toward it, the world around me seemed to warp and stretch, as though reality itself were breaking apart. The darkness clung to me, but the light was closer now, closer than ever. I could hear the man's voice behind me, but I didn't turn. I couldn't afford to look back. "You can't escape," his voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath me. "You are mine." But the light was real. It was my escape, my salvation. I could feel its warmth on my skin, its energy filling me, pushing me forward. I reached the edge of the light, and for the briefest moment, I hesitated. The darkness behind me, the man's voice, the fear, it all threatened to pull me back. But then, I stepped into the light. And everything went white. The next thing I knew, I was standing. Not on the twisted road, not in the place of shadows, but on solid ground. The air was warm, the sky above me was clear, and for the first time since I had entered that place, I felt alive. I looked around, but there was nothing. No twisted road, no man, no woman. Just an empty field, stretching as far as I could see, bathed in the gentle glow of daylight. The world was quiet, peaceful. But then, something cold brushed against the back of my neck, like a breath on the wind. The voice. "You can never truly leave," it whispered, a chill that sent a shiver through my spine. I turned around, but there was no one there. I was alone. Or so I thought. As I stood there, the shadows began to stretch once again, creeping across the field like tendrils reaching for me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and the world began to distort once more, like it was folding in on itself. The man's face appeared, flickering like a shadow in the corner of my vision. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel them in my soul. "Welcome home," he said, his voice distant, yet everywhere at once. And as the light began to fade, and the shadows closed in once again, I realized the truth. I had escaped the road. I had escaped the darkness. But I hadn't escaped him. Not really. I had become part of the road. And the road would never let me go. Have you ever moved into a new place, full of excitement and expectations, only to realize something's not quite right? The feeling that something or someone is watching you? Or the sense that there's something hiding just beyond your perception, waiting to make itself known? I didn't know what it was, but I felt it the moment I stepped into my new apartment. It was a small space, modest but affordable, ideal for someone like me, new to the city and starting over. The walls were thin, the floor creaked underfoot, and there was an odd scent in the air, like the remnants of an old home. But it was mine now, and I was determined to make it work. At first, everything was fine. I unpacked, rearranged the furniture, settled in. There was a sense of relief that came with the change, with the idea that I was finally in control of my own space. But then, it started. The noise. It began as a faint tapping from the wall. Soft at first, barely noticeable, like a knock that never quite stopped. I thought it was the pipes, an old building like this, full of quirks. The sound wasn't disturbing, just strange. But over the next few days, it became harder to ignore. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound, tapping, tapping, tapping. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, persistent. Like someone was trying to get my attention from the other side of the wall. I'd get up, walk over to it, press my ear to the plaster, but all I heard was the muffled thudding of my own heartbeat. No one was there. The more I tried to dismiss it, the worse it became. It was as if the wall itself had a life of its own. And then it started changing. The tapping grew louder, sharper, more insistent. Some nights it would wake me up, reverberating through the room, making my teeth rattle. The noise seemed to shift, like a deep thud, followed by something that felt almost like whispering. I couldn't make out the words, just a murmur, faint, but undeniably there. And it wasn't just the wall. The floor would creak in ways that didn't match my movements. The lights flickered intermittently, as if something invisible was toying with the electrical wiring. One night, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed a chair, climbed up to the wall where the tapping had been coming from, and I pounded my fist against it. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice thick with frustration. "Just stop!" There was silence for a moment, and for a brief second, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But then, a soft voice, a whisper, came from the wall itself. It was faint at first, like the sound of someone just beyond the door. "Help us." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Did I hear that? Was I losing my mind? I pressed my ear to the wall again, my breath shallow. Nothing. Just the sound of the building settling. Maybe it was the wind. Or maybe the pipes. But it didn't feel like that. It felt real. I backed away from the wall, my pulse racing, my mind spinning. The sound of the whisper lingered in my ears, echoing even though it was gone. For hours, I sat in my chair, staring at the wall, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The apartment remained still, as though mocking my fears. The next few days passed in a blur, each one more unsettling than the last. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. At night, I couldn't sleep. I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear the voices behind the wall. They seemed to be calling to me, their words becoming clearer, more desperate. "Please, help us." I could no longer ignore it. The voices weren't just coming from the wall, they were coming from inside it. And whatever was there, whoever was behind those walls, was trying to reach out. But why? And what did they want? One evening, after another long day of listening to the faint whispers and relentless tapping, I made up my mind. I had to find out what was going on. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I gathered my tools, hammer, screwdriver, flashlight, and started on the wall. My hands shook as I pried off the drywall, the noise of the screws turning too loud in the silence. With every strip of wall I removed, the sound seemed to get louder, the whispers clearer. "Please, you have to help." I reached the inside of the wall and shone my flashlight into the dark space behind it. There was nothing there, just insulation and old wiring. But then I noticed something, a small, black mark on the inside of the wall. It looked like a stain, a dark smear. I ran my fingers along it, and as I did, I felt the wall shift, as though something on the other side had moved. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. Complete silence. And then, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. Something was moving behind the wall, closer to where I had just broken through. My heart pounded in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sound grew louder, and I took a step back, my breath quickening. The space behind the wall seemed to breathe like a living thing, and then I saw it. A shadow, deep and dark, moving through the opening I had created. I backed away from the wall, my legs shaking, and the shadow followed. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have done this." The voice was low, guttural, and wrong, as if it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. My skin crawled. I could feel the presence behind the wall, closer now, like a suffocating weight pressing in on me. I ran. I ran out of that room, out of the apartment, into the hallway, and down the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the cold night air filling my lungs. But even as I stood there, safe in the open, the whispers didn't stop. They were in my head now. "Help us." The cold night air didn't seem to calm me, and the streetlights outside flickered nervously, as if they, too, were unsettled by something unseen. I stood there, on the sidewalk, hands trembling, trying to shake the images from my mind. The whispering voice still echoed in my thoughts, a cold reminder that I had done something irreversible. I hadn't gone far, just far enough to put some distance between me and that wall, but the nagging feeling lingered. I had broken through the barrier, and whatever was on the other side knew it. As the night dragged on, I found myself unable to sleep. The voices grew louder in my mind, more insistent. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them pleading, begging, their words becoming a cacophony of desperate noise. "Please, you have to help us. You're the only one who can hear us." The more I tried to ignore them, the worse it became. The walls of my apartment, my sanctuary, no longer felt like a safe place. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was walking just behind me. The following day, I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that apartment. I considered calling someone, anyone, for help. A friend, a landlord, even the police. But something in my gut stopped me. What could I say? How could I explain what had happened? There's something in the walls? No one would believe me. No one could. So, I returned. I forced myself to climb the steps back to my apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. The door opened with a quiet creak, and as I stepped inside, I was immediately struck by the silence. The oppressive quiet that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I could feel the weight of the apartment pressing down on me, as if the building itself was aware of my intrusion. The wall, the broken wall, loomed before me, its jagged edges still exposed, the hole gaping like an open wound. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to get any closer. But somehow, my feet moved forward. As I stood before the hole, the whispers returned, swirling in the air around me, filling the space with their demands. "Help us." I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The air around me felt thick, and the shadows seemed to writhe, as if they had a life of their own. The voices weren't just in my mind anymore. They were here. In the room. Coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. "Please. Please, help us." I reached for the flashlight I had used the night before, my hand shaking as I turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the exposed section of the wall. For a moment, nothing happened. The whispers had faded again, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent light above. But then, A figure. A shape. It was there, just beyond the hole in the wall. A shadow. No, more like a presence. It moved, slow and deliberate, as if it were inspecting me. And then, from the darkness, I heard the voice again. Help us. Please. The words felt colder this time, more urgent, like a cry from someone lost in the void. My body froze. I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real? Or was I losing my mind? The shadows seemed to grow, stretching along the wall like it was reaching for me. And then, a cold hand, no, a presence pressed against my back. I spun around, but no one was there. Nothing but the stillness of the room. But the air felt different. Heavier. The whispers were louder now, too loud to ignore. They filled my head, rattling my thoughts, their desperation a constant hum that I couldn't escape. Help us, please. I stumbled backward, my mind frantic with panic. What was happening? What did they want from me? Why me? The floor beneath me groaned as though the building itself was shifting. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space around me shrinking, trapping me in the very place I had once called my home. My breath quickened. I turned to leave, to escape, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, jammed shut, as if something were holding it closed from the other side. I was trapped. I felt it then, something cold, something wet, something crawling along the walls. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed up by the sound of the whispers. The walls were closing in around me, but it wasn't just the walls anymore. The whole apartment was alive, and it was suffocating me. With my heart pounding in my ears, I looked at the hole in the wall once more. The shadows within it beckoned me, growing darker, deeper. And then I heard a voice. You shouldn't have come back. I didn't know if it was the same voice or something new. I didn't know if it was coming from the wall or if it was in my head. All I knew was that it was real. And it was waiting for me. I backed away from the wall, my legs shaky, my mind racing for a way out. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before whatever was in the walls reached me. I couldn't let it get me, too. I wouldn't let it. But the whispers, they were everywhere now. And I knew it was too late. I had been pulled into something far darker than I had ever imagined. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, and the very air in the room felt alive, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. Every step I took, every movement I made, seemed to amplify the whispers. They were no longer just voices, they were a physical presence, crawling into my thoughts, twisting them, distorting my reality. I backed away from the wall, my legs shaky beneath me, my pulse thudding in my ears. My hands fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, locked, stuck, impossible to open. My fingers burned as I pulled and tugged, trying to force it, but the door stayed firm, as if something on the other side was holding it shut, keeping me in. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, now accompanied by a scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. It wasn't just behind the wall anymore, it was everywhere. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the light above buzzed, and the air became thick with an unbearable, oppressive presence. Help us. Please. I spun around, scanning the room, my mind desperately trying to grasp onto some fragment of normality. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadows, the whispers, and that feeling that I was no longer alone. And then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my vision. For a split second, I thought it was my reflection in the window. But no, there was something wrong about it. The shadow was moving, twitching unnaturally, its form not quite human. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure seemed to stretch, bend, distort, as if it was struggling to hold its shape. The whispers stopped for a moment, and I heard it clearly. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice came from the figure. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence with an eerie clarity. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It stayed there, like a dark stain on the air, its outline indistinct, as though it didn't belong to this world. I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I saw it more clearly, its eyes, two deep, hollow voids, staring at me. Its mouth opened, wide, far too wide, stretching impossibly far, and in that moment, I understood. The shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it. A being that didn't belong, trying to pull me into its world. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just ran. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath sharp and panicked, my feet barely touching the ground as I tore through the apartment, looking for any way out. But the apartment was changing. The walls seemed to bend, the rooms distorting around me. The hallway stretched longer, the windows became dark, and the doors were no longer where they should be. Every corner I turned, every step I took, seemed to bring me further into the heart of the nightmare. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The whispers drowned it out, pulling at my mind, pressing against my skull like a vice. I stumbled into the kitchen, my hands grasping at the countertops for support. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature had dropped, cold, bitter cold, seeping into my bones. That's when I saw it. In the corner, near the far wall, the shadow had appeared again. But this time, it wasn't just one figure, it was many. Dozens, hundreds, dark shapes, flickering in and out of existence, pressing on me from all sides. They were closing in, surrounding me, their voices merging into one continuous wail. "Help us! Help us!" I could feel the weight of their presence now, cold, oppressive, and endless. The room spun around me, and I could no longer tell if I was standing or falling. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was no way out. And then, the shadows began to speak as one. Their voices blended together into a chorus of despair. "You shouldn't have come here. You're one of us now. You can't leave." I was shaking, my legs barely holding me up. I reached out for anything to hold on to, but my hands passed through the air as though nothing was real, as though I had crossed over into a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. There was a deafening crack, and suddenly the room shifted. The shadows were gone, but in their place was something far worse. The walls were bleeding. I watched, frozen, as the plaster began to crack, then split open, revealing thick, dark tendrils that writhed like living things beneath the surface. The blood, it wasn't just on the walls. It was everywhere. It poured from the cracks, dripping to the floor, pooling around my feet. And in the midst of it, I heard the voices again, louder than ever. "Help us." The words were clearer now, more urgent. I looked around in a panic, desperately searching for an escape. But the door, the windows, they were gone. There was no way out. The blood began to rise, swirling around my ankles, creeping up my legs. It felt cold, like ice, and it burned as it touched my skin. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the voices. And then, something else moved in the shadows. A figure. Not one of the dark shapes, but something more solid. A woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her hands pressed against the wall, as if trying to break through it. She was reaching for me. And then I realized. She was one of them. I was too late. I was one of them now. I tried to pull away, but the blood was dragging me down, pulling me deeper into the ground, into the wall itself. The woman's face was now inches from mine, her eyes empty and lifeless, her mouth still trying to scream in silent agony. And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the world was different. The apartment wasn't the same. The walls, those cursed walls, had shifted, rearranged, and swallowed everything whole. The floor beneath me felt soft, like the ground was made of something other than wood. Something unnatural. I was no longer standing. My body lay sprawled across the floor, limbs cold and stiff, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I pushed myself up, but it was harder than usual, like gravity itself was resisting my efforts. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. I looked around, my eyes darting across the room, trying to make sense of where I was. The apartment still looked familiar, but there were shadows, dark, shifting patches of nothingness that seemed to stretch across the corners, curling at the edges like something alive. They clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the very air. The more I focused on them, the more they seemed to move, to watch. The door, the windows, all of the exits were gone, obliterated. The apartment seemed to have collapsed in on itself, and in its place, there was nothing but darkness, suffocating and endless. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were breathing. Then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, distant, but growing louder, more insistent. Help us, you shouldn't be here. The voices surrounded me, not from one direction, but from every direction. They were in the walls, in the floor, in the air I breathed. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, my body trembling as if the very core of me had been drained. My skin felt thin, as though the blood that once ran through my veins had been replaced by something colder, something darker. I could feel the pressure of the walls around me, closing in, pressing on my chest, on my mind. They were alive, these walls, and they were pulling me deeper into them, pulling me into their embrace. Then, I saw her again, the woman. Her face appeared at the corner of the room, her wide, empty eyes staring at me with an expression of pure despair. She was pressed against the wall, her hands scraping at the surface, her mouth moving in silent screams. But no sound came from her lips. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. She was so close now, inches away, but I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch as she pressed harder against the wall, her body merging with the surface, her form twisting, dissolving into the very fabric of the apartment. It was happening again. I stumbled back, my hands reaching for something, anything, to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the wall, and immediately, the sensation overwhelmed me. Cold, wet, pulsing, like I had just placed my hand into a puddle of blood that had long since dried but still saturated the stone. It was alive. The wall was alive. And then it hit me, they weren't trapped in the walls. They were part of it. All those voices, those figures, they had become the apartment. The walls, the floor, the air, they were all a prison. A prison I had unknowingly stepped into. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice growled from behind me. I froze. It wasn't the voice of a woman. It wasn't even one of the familiar whispers. This was something else, something darker, something ancient. The voice felt old, centuries old, filled with an anger that I could almost taste in the air. I turned slowly, dread crawling up my spine. The shadow that had been lingering at the edge of the room took form. It wasn't a man or a woman. It wasn't even human. It was a shape, an amalgamation of darkness, shifting, writhing, ever-changing, its features obscured. It was the very embodiment of the apartment's malevolent force, a being woven from the fabric of its walls. "You belong here now," it hissed. "You were always meant to be here." The floor beneath me trembled, and I felt myself being drawn closer to the wall, pulled by an unseen force, an irresistible tug. My body refused to obey, my legs failing to move, my mind screaming for freedom. But no matter how hard I fought, no matter how desperately I clawed at the floor, the apartment held me tight, its grip unrelenting. The shadow moved closer, its form solidifying, taking on a twisted, grotesque shape. It was an awful blend of human and inhuman features, sharp, jagged edges, eyes that seemed to bleed darkness, a mouth too wide to be real, with teeth that gleamed like knives. "You are one of us," it whispered, the words curling around me like a serpent's tongue. My pulse quickened. I could feel my mind slipping away, drowning in the sound of the whispers, in the cold, in the endless pull of the walls. My vision blurred as the room spun around me, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw the door, just a crack, a sliver of light, an escape. I lunged for it, but the shadow caught me before I could reach it. It wrapped its tendrils around me, cold, thick, like chains made of darkness, and yanked me back into the heart of the apartment. "No one leaves," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. I screamed as the darkness closed in around me, suffocating me, swallowing me whole. And then I realized it was too late. I had become a part of the wall. I had no sense of time. Days, hours, or even minutes, they all blurred into an endless stretch of cold, suffocating darkness. My body felt frozen, but not from the outside. It was as if the very essence of me had been trapped in a place where time didn't matter, where nothing moved except the oppressive weight of the walls around me. I could feel them now. The walls. Not just as a physical presence, but as a consciousness. They were alive, breathing, thinking. Their whispers had become louder, more distinct, merging into a single voice, a chorus of 1,000 souls that had been swallowed by this place long before I had ever arrived. "You are part of us now." The words came from all directions at once, echoing in my mind. I didn't know if they were real or if I had imagined them, but they felt real. They made my skin crawl. The walls wanted me. They had always wanted me. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't obey. It was as though my body had fused with the floor, with the air around me. I could sense the others now, other souls, lost like me, bound to this place. I could feel their presence, pressing against me from all sides. Some of them whispered, others cried out in silent desperation. Their voices were a cacophony of pain, grief, and pleading, each one a thread in the web of this terrible place. I was never supposed to leave. I tried to scream, to shout, to do anything that could break the suffocating silence. But there was no sound. My voice was trapped inside me, lost to the walls. Then something stirred. A shift in the air. A cold gust that shouldn't have been there. The darkness parted, just for a moment, and I saw something, a sliver of light. It was faint, distant, but it was there. A crack, a tear in the fabric of this nightmare. It called to me, pulling at the remnants of my sanity, urging me to escape. But how could I? I was part of the wall now. My body, my mind, they were woven into the very structure of the apartment. The more I tried to move toward the light, the more I felt myself pulling back, dragged into the abyss that had consumed everything. And yet, the light, it was there. I pushed. I struggled. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to escape, to reach the light. But it wasn't easy. The walls fought back. They wrapped around me, squeezing tighter, the voices growing louder, more frantic. I could hear them now, feel them inside me, their thoughts, their fears, their anger. They were all desperate to stop me. They didn't want me to escape. They wanted me to stay with them forever, to become just another echo in the darkness. You cannot leave, they whispered. You are ours now. But the light, it was closer now. I could almost feel its warmth against my skin, the promise of freedom. I had to push. I had to escape. The voices grew frantic, the walls shook with their anger, but I kept moving. The light was just beyond reach. And then, in one final surge of willpower, I tore myself free. The world exploded in a flash of brightness. For a moment, I thought I had died. But when my eyes opened, I was outside. The air was different, fresh, crisp, not the stale, suffocating air of the apartment. I was standing on the street, bathed in the pale light of the moon, the familiar buildings of the city stretching out before me. The sound of traffic in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the trees, it all seemed so normal. But something wasn't right. I looked around. The apartment building was gone. The place where I had lived, where I had been trapped, was no longer there. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, an old, crumbling fence surrounding it. I took a step forward, my legs shaky, my mind still reeling from what had happened. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. And yet, as I stood there, the whispers began again. Soft at first, like a breeze, then louder. Help us. Help us. You shouldn't have left. I turned, my heart racing, my body trembling. The air around me grew cold, and I could feel the walls closing in again, their presence surrounding me. They were waiting for me. And then I realized the apartment, the walls, the voices, they weren't gone. They had followed me. I had escaped, but I would never be free. The walls had me now, and they would never let me go. Have you ever felt that someone was watching you, but when you turned around, no one was there? What if it wasn't your imagination, but something much darker, something that only you could see, something waiting to be discovered? I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I bought the mirror. It seemed harmless at first. It was an antique, old but beautifully crafted, with a rich wooden frame, intricate carvings that swirled like vines. The moment I saw it in the dim light of the antique store, something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was the way the glass glimmered, or the way the shopkeeper spoke of it with such reverence, something ancient and rare. I didn't think much of it, only that it seemed to belong in my living room. I had always been drawn to old things, things with a history. My apartment was filled with antiques, items with stories, and to me, they felt like pieces of the past, fragments that could offer connection in a world that felt increasingly empty. But this mirror was different. I didn't know it yet, but it was about to change everything. The first night it arrived, I hung it on the wall by the door. It was beautiful, reflecting the soft light from the lamp I had set nearby. I stood before it, adjusting its angle, admiring how it fit into the room. But when I stepped back to get a better look, something caught me off guard. My reflection wasn't there, not entirely. I stared at the mirror, my eyes scanning every inch of it. It wasn't broken, no cracks or defects in the glass. The frame, perfectly intact. Yet, there was no reflection of me standing in front of it. Only the room behind me. It was as if I wasn't even there. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I thought maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I shrugged it off and turned to leave the room. But as I passed by the mirror again, I caught a glimpse of someone moving in the glass. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I stood still for a moment, eyes fixed on the mirror. There was no reflection of me, but there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A shadow, a movement so quick it was barely perceptible. I wasn't imagining it. The room felt colder, and for a moment, the air itself felt thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. It must be broken, I thought, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was watching me from that mirror, something that didn't belong. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to tell myself it was just an old object, nothing to be afraid of. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could almost feel its cold, glassy surface staring back at me, its reflection, or lack of it, haunting me. The next day, I invited my friend Mia over. I wanted to get a second opinion, someone else's perspective. Maybe she'd think I was just being paranoid. "Do you see anything weird in this mirror?" I asked her, trying to sound casual, but my voice shook slightly. Mia walked over to it, her eyes narrowing as she looked into the glass. "No," she said after a pause, "it seems fine to me. I don't see anything wrong with it." I wanted to believe her. I did, but I couldn't ignore the way the room felt when I was alone. The way it felt like the mirror had changed. That night, when Mia left, I sat in my living room, staring at the empty reflection. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. I tried not to focus on the mirror, but it felt like it was pulling me in, like the darkness behind the glass was becoming more alive. I stood up, my feet heavy, as if something in the room was weighing me down. The mirror called to me. I walked slowly toward it, my fingers brushing against the cold frame. Then, for the first time since it had arrived, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't the reflection I was used to. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear, my mouth open as if I was screaming, though no sound came. But it wasn't just me. There was something else, something lurking in the glass behind me, something not human. A figure, barely visible, its features obscured by shadows, its outline hazy and twisted. The figure was moving closer, inching toward me. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, my heart racing. My reflection seemed to shift, like the figure in the mirror was trying to break free, trying to reach me. I couldn't breathe. I turned to flee, but when I looked back at the mirror, it was empty again. There was no figure. There was no one but me, standing, breathing, alone. But the feeling stayed. Something was wrong with that mirror, something beyond what I could understand. I felt it in the air, in the silence, in the way my own reflection seemed to be mocking me. It was as if it knew something I didn't, something dark and deep hidden behind its surface. The mirror had shown me only one thing: I was never truly alone. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't escape the unsettling feeling the mirror had left me with. It was as if it had planted something deep in my mind, a seed that had begun to grow, whispering thoughts I couldn't ignore. The mirror sat there, innocuous, in its place by the door, its smooth surface reflecting nothing but emptiness whenever I glanced at it. But it wasn't empty, not really. I knew that now. It was never empty. I tried to keep myself busy, to drown out the unease with work, errands, anything that would distract me from the constant pressure of that mirror. But even when I wasn't home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt its presence in the back of my mind, like a shadow that wouldn't leave, always lurking just outside my thoughts. And then, one evening, something happened that made the fear real. I had been out all day, and when I returned to my apartment, I was exhausted. It was late, almost midnight, and the only sound in the air was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant city noises outside. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and walked toward the bathroom, my eyes automatically flicking to the mirror as I passed by it. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Just a flash, like the reflection of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I stopped and looked at the glass directly, there was nothing. No shadows. No figures. Just the empty room behind me. I let out a breath, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I told myself. Just your imagination. But as I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was waiting for me to turn back, to look again. I went about my evening routine, forcing myself to focus on the mundane. I cooked a simple dinner, sat down to eat, tried to watch a show to distract myself. But I could feel the mirror's pull, like a weight pressing against my chest, reminding me of its presence. After a while, I stood up to clean the dishes. As I passed by the mirror, I had to look. I couldn't resist it anymore. This time, I didn't just glance at it. I stared. I stood there, my breath shallow, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. The room behind me was reflected perfectly. My apartment, my own figure, standing in front of the mirror, everything was normal. Then, a small shift. Just the slightest distortion in the glass. The reflection of the room rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. And there, in the middle of the glass, something began to form. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection of something from the window, but no. This wasn't a shadow cast from outside. It was darker, more defined. It moved. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that the figure in the mirror wasn't mine. It was someone else's. A vague silhouette, tall, with a shape that didn't quite match the way I stood. It was too thin, too unnatural, its edges jagged, like it was being pulled in every direction. I stepped back, the breath leaving my lungs in a rush. "Hello?" My voice came out small, shaky, like I was speaking to the glass itself. But there was no answer, no sound, except for the faint hum of the apartment systems. The figure remained in the glass, unmoving. I reached out a hand, as if to touch the surface, to see if I could disturb it somehow. But before I could, the shadow shifted. It moved closer. It was now standing directly behind me, its presence pressing against the glass, as though it were trying to break through, to get closer. I froze. My skin went cold. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. The reflection of the shadow flickered, as though the glass itself was struggling to hold it back. And then I saw it, a faint outline of a face, too blurry to make out clearly, but it was there, watching me. I stumbled back, knocking into the chair behind me. The shadow stayed in place, unmoving, as if it had no intention of leaving. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass. I couldn't look away. Something in the reflection demanded my attention. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The glass returned to its usual stillness, the reflection of the room unchanged. There was no sign of the figure anymore, no trace of its presence. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't gone. It was still there, watching. I wanted to leave, to get away from that mirror, to escape whatever it was that had started this. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't. It had already latched onto me, like a parasite, and I was its unwilling host. I turned away from the mirror, my legs shaky, my mind racing. I needed to get some sleep. I needed to forget. But as I walked away, I heard something faint, a whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. It was a voice. A soft, barely audible voice, like a whisper in the dark. "You can't run from me." I froze. The voice sounded like it was right behind me, as if the reflection were speaking directly to me. My blood ran cold. The whisper came again. "You're not alone." I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, but the mirror was empty. No shadows. No figures. Just me. Just my reflection. But somehow, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone anymore. The days after that night bled together in a haze of unease. I tried to go about my life as normal, but everything had changed. The mirror wasn't just a mirror anymore, it was a presence. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow that had appeared, the whisper that had crawled into my ears. The more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed my thoughts. It followed me, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the perfect moment to return. I couldn't look at the mirror without feeling the pressure of its gaze, as if something was waiting for me to do more than just glance at it. Every time I passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, that it was reaching out, trying to pull me in. I avoided the living room for days. I left the apartment as much as I could, even spending time with friends, anything to keep myself from facing that mirror. But when I returned home each night, the unease would settle back in. The silence was deafening, and the moment I walked through the door, I could feel it. The watchful eyes. The sense that something was there, just out of sight. I decided to move the mirror, hoping that maybe, out of sight, it would lose its power over me. I struggled to lift it, its weight surprisingly heavy, even though it wasn't large. When I finally managed to get it off the wall, I turned it around to face the back. I thought that would be enough to make it stop, put it out of view, hide it in the corner. But even as I set it down, I couldn't help but feel a strange, nagging sense of discomfort. There was something wrong with it. Something I couldn't explain. The mirror wasn't just an object, it felt like it had a mind of its own. I went to bed that night hoping for rest. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The longer I spent in that apartment, the more my sense of reality started to feel warped. Like I wasn't quite sure what was real anymore. My dreams were filled with distorted images of the mirror, its glass swirling and warping, its frame changing shape. And always, the shadow would return. It would be there, moving behind me, standing just out of reach. The whispering voice. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I did was check the mirror. I couldn't help it. I needed to know if it had moved. To my surprise, it hadn't. It was still there, lying face down on the floor in the corner of the room. But something was different. The back of the mirror, normally a plain, unfinished wood, was covered in scratches. Small, deep gouges that seemed to form a pattern, like writing. I kneeled down, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. I reached out to touch the marks, but before I could, a chill ran up my spine. The scratches were random. They were words. I could make out only part of the message, but what I saw was enough to send a wave of fear crashing over me. You are mine. I recoiled, pulling my hand away as if the mirror had burned me. But it wasn't the mirror that scared me. It was what those words meant. That thing, whatever it was, had been trying to communicate with me. It was getting closer, getting bolder. It wasn't just a shadow or whisper anymore. It was leaving its mark. I tried to stand up, to walk away, but my legs felt weak. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls were too close, the air too thick, as if the space itself was shrinking. I could feel it again, the presence. That feeling of being watched, not just from the mirror, but from all around me. I turned to leave the room, desperate to get out, but as I stepped into the hallway, something stopped me. A sound. A knock. It came from the wall, right next to me. At first, it was quiet, barely audible, like the tapping of a finger against wood. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like something or someone was trying to get through. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking continued, rhythmic, like it was in time with my heartbeat. Tap. 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 I glanced toward the source of the noise. It was coming from behind the wall where the mirror had once hung. I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it. It was there, real, solid. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. But I wasn't alone. I could feel the air shift, thickening, turning heavy. A pressure built in the room, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked around, my eyes frantic, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. And then, I saw it. In the reflection of the hallway, just beyond the doorframe, there was a figure. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the reflection I was used to. It was someone else, a shadow, standing just out of sight, watching me. The figure was tall, distorted, its form flickering like a broken image on a screen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure was standing behind me in the reflection, its form stretching, twisting, its face slowly becoming clearer. It wasn't human. The whisper came again, louder this time, like a voice echoing through the walls, vibrating in my bones. You're never alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. Only the empty hallway. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. And now it was smiling. A twisted, horrifying grin. And that was when I knew. The grin was the last thing I saw before everything went dark. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that thing in the mirror. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. My mind was frozen, paralyzed by the terror of what I was seeing. The shadow was there, smiling, its face stretching unnaturally wide. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and the grin, it seemed to grow, becoming more and more grotesque with every passing second. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was a statue, locked in place. The longer I stared at it, the harder it became to distinguish where I ended and it began. I felt like I was slipping into the mirror, like it was pulling me in. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. They echoed around me, their source impossible to pinpoint. They filled the air, pressing against my ears until it felt like my head would explode. You belong to us now. The voice was cold and distant, yet right next to me, as though the walls themselves were speaking. And then, a shift. I felt the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting. My breath came out in invisible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if the world around me had turned to ice, and I was at the center of it all. I wanted to move, to escape, but my body was no longer my own. The fear that had taken root in my chest spread throughout my entire body, locking me in place, holding me captive in this nightmare. The figure in the mirror wasn't just watching me anymore, it was coming for me. The moment the figure took a step toward me in the reflection, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was pressing down on my heart. I gasped for air, but the air was thick, suffocating. My hands trembled, reaching out, instinctively trying to touch the mirror, as though somehow that could pull me out of this madness. But as my fingers brushed against the cold surface, something snapped. I recoiled, stumbling back as I saw a hand, a real hand, press against the other side of the glass. It wasn't my own. It was darker, larger, with long, claw-like fingers. The hand pressed harder against the mirror, as if it was trying to break through. My heart stopped. I couldn't look away. The figure was closer now, too close. I could feel its presence behind me, despite knowing that I was alone in the room. The whispers were growing louder, now turning into distorted voices, almost like a chorus of people speaking over each other in an unintelligible language. And then, I heard something else, a low growl, almost like an animal in pain. It wasn't human. The reflection, it moved. Slowly at first, but with growing intensity. The figure raised its arm, its hand, no longer a hand, now an appendage of claws and shadows, reaching out as though it could tear through the fabric of reality itself. I could see it clearly now. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood. It was something else, a collection of nightmares, a thing born from the dark, from the places beyond the edges of the world. The reflection shifted, its body writhing and undulating like it was made of liquid, a nightmare in constant motion. I screamed. I had to scream. I turned away from the mirror, trying to pull myself free from whatever hold it had on me, but the room was different now. The walls seemed to be moving closer, the air thicker. The floor felt unsteady beneath me, as if it was shifting, undulating. I stumbled forward, trying to get out of the room, but my legs were weak, unresponsive, like they were made of stone. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the reflection in the mirror, I could still see it, was following me. I reached the door, pulling on the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers slipped, sweating, desperately trying to force the door open. I pulled harder, but the door didn't move. It was locked, impossibly locked. The figure in the mirror grew stronger, more solid. It was pressing against the glass now, its face contorting in agony, its features melting and shifting in impossible ways. Its smile grew wider, stretching so far that its mouth was a jagged, gaping hole of darkness. It was mocking me, playing with me. "You can't escape," the voice hissed. "You belong to me. You belong here." The words were like needles, piercing into my mind, weaving into my thoughts. I was trapped, and there was no way out. I don't know how long I stood there, banging on the door, screaming, pleading. My vision blurred, and the edges of reality seemed to bend. The room, the walls, the mirror, they were all closing in on me. The whispers swirled in my ears, the voice mocking me, telling me that there was no escape. But then, I heard something else. A soft crack, like glass breaking. I turned toward the mirror one last time. My reflection was gone. The figure stood there, fully formed, a towering shadow that seemed to fill the entire room, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It reached out toward me, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I felt its touch. It was cold. The darkness in the room deepened as the mirror shattered, the shards falling around me like rain. And then, silence. I woke up on the floor, my body aching, my heart pounding. The shattered pieces of the mirror lay scattered around me, gleaming like broken teeth in the dim light of the room. My breath came in short, frantic bursts as I tried to collect myself, to understand what had just happened. My mind felt foggy, disconnected, but I knew one thing for sure: the thing I had seen, that thing in the mirror, was still there. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my veins. The door still locked. The walls still too close. I ran my hands over the surface of the door, feeling the cool metal of the handle. No, this can't be real. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick like a weight pressing down on my chest. It was too quiet. The whispers had stopped. The growling, the unearthly sounds, all gone. I didn't trust the silence. I knew better than to believe that it meant safety. I looked around, my eyes darting from one corner to the next, but nothing seemed out of place. The room appeared unchanged, save for the broken mirror. The glass shards sparkled on the floor, and the reflection was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had happened was a nightmare, a hallucination, and the mirror was simply an ordinary piece of glass now. But the cold feeling in my chest, the shiver running down my spine, it told me otherwise. I didn't want to look at the mirror. I didn't want to know what was left behind, but something inside me forced my eyes toward the broken glass. I couldn't stop myself. It was like the pieces were calling to me, urging me to look, to understand. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart racing faster with each inch closer I came. The glass shards glinted in the light, the jagged edges sharp and dangerous. My reflection wasn't there. But that's when I noticed it. In the reflection of the shards scattered on the floor, I saw the outline of someone, standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the door still locked. I felt the heat in my chest rise to a boil, panic clawing at my throat. No, it wasn't possible. I was alone. But then, I saw it again. A figure. Just barely visible in the reflection. I wasn't looking into the mirror now. I was looking at the broken pieces scattered on the floor, at the shards that lay like sharp teeth, but even they were wrong. In each one, the figure was different. In one piece, the figure was barely a shadow. In another, it was clearer, its shape more defined, but its face still hidden. And in every shard, the thing was smiling, its grin stretching wider and wider with each passing second. The voices returned, whispering, soft at first, then growing louder, more desperate. I could hear the words now. You can't escape. The sound crawled into my ears, like something crawling beneath my skin. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, but I couldn't escape the shards. No matter where I turned, they were there, reflecting it, showing me the thing, showing me the smile. It was closer now, not just in the mirror, but in the room. I could feel its presence behind me, pressing against me like a cold breath down my neck. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the reflection in the shards shifted. I saw it clearly now, its face, twisted and unnatural, its eyes empty black voids, the grin far too wide, stretching beyond what was possible. The shadows in the shards began to move, like they were alive, crawling toward me. They reached out with long fingers that brushed against my skin, cold and clammy, sending jolts of ice through my body. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to tear down the walls, to shatter the glass and make the thing go away. But my legs were frozen, my body locked in place. And then I heard it clear as day. The voice that had been whispering in my mind now spoke out loud, directly behind me. I am the reflection. And now you are mine. The air grew thick, and the room began to pulse, as if it were breathing. I turned around, but it was too late. The reflection in the shards was no longer just an image, it was alive. It was pulling itself free from the glass, its form rippling, twisting like it was made of smoke, its limbs stretching unnaturally, extending toward me. The shadows surrounded me, wrapping around my body, holding me in place. I felt its cold fingers brush against my skin, and I knew it was not just in the mirror anymore. It was here. The grin on its face was the last thing I saw before everything went black. It had always been just another part of my routine. The walk home from work, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the empty streets, and the familiar bus stop in the distance. Every evening, the same rhythm. Every evening, the same walk. But for some reason, recently, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a strange feeling, a nagging discomfort that I couldn't shake. And it all centered around that one thing, the lamp at the bus stop. I had no reason to be afraid of it. It was just a streetlight, casting its yellowish glow over the bench and the pavement, illuminating the waiting area. But it had started to flicker when I passed by, blinking on and off as if reacting to my presence. At first, I shrugged it off, attributing it to some faulty wiring. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Every time I walked past that spot, the same thing, the light would flicker on, off, as if it was waiting for me. It was on one of these nights, as I walked home after a long day at work, that things began to change. As usual, I approached the bus stop, the light flickering faintly in the distance. But this time, something was different. The flickering wasn't just the usual on and off. It slowed down, paused for a moment, then flickered faster, like the light was struggling, trying to keep up with something. It was deliberate. I stopped, my feet frozen in place as I stared at the lamp. The air around me felt heavier, colder. The faint hum of the city seemed to vanish, leaving behind a deep silence. A silence that felt wrong, unnatural. And then I saw it. A shape just beneath the lamp. At first, it was hard to make out, just a vague outline in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see it more clearly, a figure standing just beyond the light's reach, its form barely visible in the shadows. It was human-shaped, but something about it didn't feel right. Its features were blurred, like a reflection in water disturbed by ripples. I took a step forward, heart pounding, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, the figure moved. It wasn't a fluid motion, more like a glitch. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as though it had evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the empty shadows. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, wondering if I had just imagined it. But no, I hadn't. I could still feel it. I could still sense something watching me. I turned around quickly, but the street was empty. Just me and the streetlights, flickering in the darkness. Shaking my head, I forced myself to continue walking. Maybe I was just tired, too many late nights, too much stress. But as I walked away from the bus stop, the flickering of the lamp behind me began again. Flicker, flicker, pause, flicker. Each time, it grew a little more intense, like it was trying to get my attention. I glanced back over my shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, there was nothing, just a bus stop and the light. But then, there it was again. The figure. It was back, standing in the same spot, this time clearer than before, but still distorted, as though it couldn't quite fit into the real world. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. I could feel the wrongness of it, like it didn't belong in this place, in this time. The lamp flickered once more, then dimmed completely, casting the entire street into darkness. I froze. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The figure wasn't just standing there. It was waiting for me. I couldn't leave. I wanted to, so badly, but something in my chest, like an invisible hand, kept me rooted to the spot. My heart hammered in my chest, and I was aware of every breath I took, too fast, too shallow. I turned my head slowly, not sure why. I didn't want to look again, but my eyes moved anyway. The mirror shards that had once been scattered across the floor were now gathered in one place. They didn't just reflect a room, they reflected me. But it wasn't my face that stared back at me. No, it was something else. Something wrong. In each piece of glass, there was an image of me, yes, but distorted. Twisted. My own reflection was not quite right. My face was blurred, the shape of my features melting together like the glass itself was trying to pull me in. The eyes weren't my eyes. They were hollow, black pools, endless, unblinking. I stepped closer. My foot moved without thought, as if some unseen force was urging me on. Each shard, reflecting that distorted version of me, felt like a beacon, pulling me deeper into the gaze of those empty eyes. I had to stop. I had to look away. But I couldn't. I was mesmerized. The air felt thick around me, pressing against my skin like it had turned to tar. The whispers in the room grew louder now, louder than before, echoing off the walls. The glass shards trembled, rattling ever so slightly as if alive, as if reacting to my proximity. The reflections in them seemed to grow more vivid, more alive. And then I heard it. The voice. It wasn't in the room anymore. It was inside me. Inside my head. You can't leave, can you? It wasn't my voice, but it felt like it came from the deepest corners of my own mind. I stumbled back, my hand reaching out, gripping the edge of the table for support. The room felt smaller now, the walls pushing in, the air thick with a strange pressure. You belong with me, the voice said again, so calm, so sure. I shook my head, trying to shake off the sensation, trying to push the words away. But they lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I had to get away. I had to leave. I spun toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating silence and the relentless whispers. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. In the corner of my eye, I saw it. The reflection of myself in the mirror shards wasn't still. It was moving. It was reaching for me. I gasped and jerked my hand away from the door. The reflection in the shards was no longer static, it was alive. I could see my own image stretching toward me, its fingers curling like tendrils of smoke, inching toward my real self. The distortion in my reflection grew, warping my body, stretching it unnaturally as if the glass itself was bending reality. The eyes in the shards, I couldn't look away from them, grew darker, the blackness inside them deepening, like they were swallowing everything in their path. I turned back to the mirror. I had to know. I had to understand. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingers brushing against one of the shards. The moment my skin touched the glass, everything stopped. The room went completely still. The air felt like it was holding its breath. And then, slowly, as if time itself had twisted, the reflection in the shards smiled. A smile so wide, so unnatural, it spread far beyond what was humanly possible. It wasn't my reflection anymore. It was something else. Something watching me. Waiting for me. "You've been chosen," the voice whispered again, this time louder than ever. It came from the reflection. It came from inside me. It felt as though the walls themselves were speaking now, vibrating with the dark energy that had built in the room. I pulled my hand back with a gasp, heart racing in my chest. The room felt colder, the air pressing harder against me. The whispers faded, but their presence lingered, thick and suffocating. The figure in the reflection wasn't just an image anymore. It was there. In the glass. In the room. In my mind. And then, as I stared, something even more disturbing happened. The door behind me, the one I had just tried to open, began to creak. Slowly. As if something was on the other side, pushing against it. It was an unmistakable sound. The door was being forced open. But there was no one there. I turned quickly, heart stopping in my chest. The handle jiggled, just enough to make the old wood groan. And that's when I realized. The reflection in the shards wasn't just a reflection anymore. It had crossed over. It was coming for me. The door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak, as if time itself was stretching, unwilling to reveal whatever lay beyond. My body was frozen, locked in place by a feeling of dread that sunk deep into my bones. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. They were glued to the floor, just like my gaze, which was still drawn to the distorted reflections in the mirror shards. The room seemed to pulse with a quiet, unnatural energy. The glass shards were no longer just reflecting. They were alive, each fragment vibrating with a sinister hum, as though they were calling to something or someone on the other side. The door creaked again, this time more forcefully, and I turned toward it. The darkness beyond was thick, suffocating. But there was no figure in the doorway. There was only the void, the air heavy with a presence that wasn't mine. Something else was there. Something waiting. I had to move. I had to escape. I'd finally found my voice, a hoarse whisper escaping my throat as I called out into the room. "Hello? Is someone there?" The silence answered me, absolute and chilling. The door shuddered again, and I realized the force pressing against it wasn't from the other side. It was something inside the room, something I hadn't noticed before. Something behind the glass. The reflections in the shards twisted again, and I could almost feel them watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The door swung open wider. I turned and bolted. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that room. But as I ran, the air felt thicker, the walls pressing in, as if the room was closing around me. The door, the one that had just been an ordinary wooden door, was no longer leading to the hallway I knew. It was now a passage to something else. A strange, overwhelming cold poured in from the opening, an ice-cold draft that seemed to carry with it the scent of dust and decay. I could hear something now, not just the distant creaking, but something else, scratching, like nails dragging across the floor. I glanced back over my shoulder, heart racing. In the doorway, something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, stretched out across the floor, twisting like a living thing. The figure, the one that had once only been a distorted reflection in the glass, was stepping forward. It was coming for me, but not in the way a person would. No. It glided, like it was made of smoke or fog, its shape constantly shifting, barely holding form. The edges of it blurred, making it difficult to focus on, and yet I could feel its presence, the cold, suffocating weight of it pressing in from all sides. I had to keep moving. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen, gripped by something I couldn't see but could feel, the air thick with the oppressive weight of whatever was in that room. The scratching noise grew louder, closer. And then I heard something else. A low, guttural whisper, one I felt deep in my bones. "You can't leave." "Not yet." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice, its source was unmistakable now. It was coming from the reflections in the shards. But it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, all layered on top of each other, each one whispering my name, calling me back. Each voice was desperate, pleading. I couldn't breathe. The shadows in the doorway stretched further, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just a shadow anymore. They were eyes. Thousands of tiny, glimmering eyes, watching me, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold. Ice cold, as though it had been frozen for centuries, wrapped around my ankle, pulling me backward. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip only tightened, dragging me toward the door. The ground seemed to slip away beneath me, and I was falling into darkness. I glanced up, my hands scrambling for something, anything, to hold on to. But all I could see were the eyes, watching, waiting, and the shadows creeping closer. The glass shards were now scattered across the floor like teeth, each one reflecting a different part of me, a different piece of my soul. And in the center of them all, the reflection of myself, my distorted, twisted reflection, smiled. It was a smile that wasn't mine, a smile full of malice, stretching too wide, too far. It was as if it had finally succeeded. Finally pulled me into its world. "You belong to us now," the voice echoed in my mind, filling every corner of the room, every shadow, every reflection. And then, everything went dark. When I awoke, it wasn't in the place I remembered. The room was different, darker. The walls were bare, stripped of the warmth they had once carried. There were no windows, no sign of the world outside. Only the cold, the thick, suffocating air that clung to my skin. I stood up slowly, my body trembling, my head spinning. Every part of me felt heavy, weighed down by something unseen. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but the surface felt wrong, smooth, too smooth, as though it was made of something other than plaster. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. But it didn't help. The darkness around me seemed to deepen, stretching further than it should. I couldn't understand where I was, But there was one thing I knew for certain. It wasn't the apartment. The door I had tried to flee through wasn't there anymore. In its place was a mirror, framed in old, dark wood. The glass was spotless, gleaming, reflecting nothing but the emptiness of the room behind me. I hesitated. My heart began to race again. I wasn't alone. There, just beyond the edge of my vision, a figure stood at the far corner of the room, too still, too quiet. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. The weight of its presence pressed on me, suffocating me from all sides. It wasn't the same as before, but it was close enough to make my blood run cold. It's watching me, I thought, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection in the glass was not mine. It was me, but not. The face was wrong. The eyes were darker, the smile too wide. It was as though someone had taken my image and twisted it, distorted it into something unnatural, something alive. The reflection moved. It was moving of its own accord. A laugh. A low, guttural sound that came from deep within the reflection, echoing in the silence. The figure in the corner of the room shifted, and the darkness around it seemed to grow. The figure was coming closer, inching toward me, yet it remained hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It was here. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the heavy silence. But the figure didn't answer. It just watched, waiting for me to make the next move. I took a slow step back, my body protesting the movement, but my mind screamed for me to do something, anything, to get away. But the floor beneath my feet felt unstable. My legs wobbled, and I could feel the pressure of the reflection pushing me, urging me closer to the mirror. I turned toward it, my eyes locking on the glass. In the reflection, I saw my own hand, my trembling hand, reach toward the mirror. But it wasn't my hand anymore. The reflection in the glass moved independently, the fingers curling in slow, deliberate motions as though they were waiting for me to make contact. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. Immediately, the room around me seemed to shift. The walls warped, stretching like melted wax, and the air grew colder still, thick with an oppressive silence. I pulled my hand back in shock, but it was too late. The reflection changed. The smile that stretched across its face grew wider, more sinister. The eyes, my eyes, flickered like something was scrambling beneath them. Something that wasn't me. The reflection seemed to step forward, its feet never quite touching the floor, floating just above the ground as it moved toward the mirror. The figure in the corner moved again, and this time I could hear it, the slow scraping of footsteps against the floor, the sound of something dragging behind it. The presence, whatever it was getting closer, moving with an unnatural slowness that filled the room with tension. I had to leave. I had to find a way out. But the mirror, it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a doorway. I stepped back again, my mind racing. There was no exit. No escape. I was trapped. The mirror was no longer just an object of reflection, it was a portal. The figure in the glass had crossed into the real world, and it was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my breath quickening. The figure was almost through now, its outstretched hand reaching for me from the other side. I turned and ran, but the walls seemed to close in on me. Every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was pulling me back. The figure in the reflection, it was following me, its twisted form emerging from the glass, its eyes locked on me with that same terrible, wide smile. I could feel it now, its breath on my neck, its icy fingers brushing against my skin. I was not alone anymore. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I screamed. But no sound came out. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become a prison, and I was the one inside it. I could feel it now, the chill creeping into my bones as the space around me seemed to stretch into an infinite void. I stumbled, my body shaking uncontrollably, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure from the reflection had fully emerged. It was here, in the room with me, and it was no longer just a distorted copy of myself. It was something else entirely, something far darker, with eyes that didn't blink, skin that shimmered like water in the moonlight, and a smile that could crack open the fabric of reality itself. It was waiting, watching, grinning. I backed into the wall, my hand reaching for the door that wasn't there. The room was gone, replaced by nothing but shadows that whispered, pulling at me, dragging me into the blackness. Every part of me screamed to flee, but where would I go? How could I escape something that had crossed from the mirror into this world? The figure took a step toward me, its movements unnatural, like it was floating, gliding over the ground. It moved closer, closer still, until I could feel its breath on my face, cold and unnatural. I could see my reflection, the one that wasn't mine, standing behind it, perfectly still. I could feel its eyes boring into me, pulling me closer into its grip. I could no longer trust the reflection. I could no longer trust myself. It smiled wider. "Do you know what it's like?" it whispered, its voice a cold, rasping hiss. "To lose yourself to the glass? To see your reflection twist and change, becoming something other, something far worse?" I tried to scream, but the sound was choked in my throat. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The room was spinning now, the darkness pressing in tighter with every breath I took. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythmic beating of my own heart. Every inch of me screamed in terror. But the reflection, it was still smiling, still waiting, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "You can't escape," it said, its voice low and mocking. "Once you've seen the truth, there is no going back. The glass is forever." The figure raised its hand, and I felt a sudden jolt of cold spread through me, as if the temperature had dropped to freezing in an instant. I wanted to pull away, but my body wouldn't move. My legs felt heavy, numb, as if they had turned to stone. And then, the reflection stepped forward. It reached out, its hand brushing against my face, its touch cold and sharp, like ice. I wanted to scream, to fight, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, as its fingers sank into my skin, leaving a trail of frost behind. I could feel myself being drawn in, my body moving closer to the mirror, to the reflection that wasn't my own. The shadows around me deepened, twisting into shapes that didn't belong, shapes that whispered my name over and over again. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive, and it was taking me with it. I reached out, desperate to break free, but there was nothing to hold on to. The glass rippled, distorting as if it was water, and I was being sucked in, pulled toward it. A wave of panic surged through me. I don't want this. I don't want to be trapped here, in this endless reflection. But no matter how hard I tried to fight, my hands were drawn to the glass, my fingers sinking into the cold surface. The figure reached toward me, its touch like ice against my skin, its face pressing closer to mine. "We are the same," it whispered, its voice in my ear now, colder than ever. "You and I. You've always been me, and I've always been you. There's no escape, no way out. You will become part of the glass, part of the reflection, forever. The last thing I saw before the glass swallowed me whole was the figure's face, my face, staring at me with that twisted, unnatural smile. And then, I was gone. I woke up, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. The air felt thick with the same suffocating weight, but the room was still. Silent. Familiar. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the floor, the mirror across the room gleaming in the dim light. It was empty. No figure. No reflection. Just me. Or at least, I thought it was me. As I looked into the mirror, my reflection smiled. But it wasn't mine. It was that same twisted smile I had seen before, the one that chilled me to the core. I couldn't tear my eyes away as it stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it seemed to consume the entire reflection. And then it whispered, "Welcome back. You were always mine." The room around me grew colder. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the reflection would never let me go. It was the second night in the hotel room when I first noticed the symbol. At first, I thought it was just a stain, some random imperfection in the carpet that I had missed earlier. But then it became clear that it wasn't. It was too precise. Too deliberate. I leaned closer to it. It was faint, like something that had been burned into the floor, but with edges too sharp to be accidental. The symbol itself was unfamiliar, a mixture of jagged lines and curves, something that looked almost like a language, but not any language I had ever seen before. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the pattern. It was cold to the touch, colder than the rest of the room, as though the floor around it had frozen. A sudden shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly pulled my hand back. I'd been traveling for hours, and exhaustion weighed heavily on my mind. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I told myself it was nothing, just a stain, just a weird coincidence. So, I tried to ignore it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. That night, the sound of the hotel's ancient heating system kept me awake, the creaks and moans of the building unsettling in the silence. It was nearly impossible to relax. My eyes kept drifting to the symbol on the floor, a quiet pull of my attention that I couldn't ignore. I eventually fell asleep, but not peacefully. I woke up in the middle of the night, the air around me strangely still. The room felt colder now, and the symbol on the floor, it was different. The lines had deepened, become clearer, more defined. There were new marks, as if something had been added to it while I slept. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. Had I imagined it? Or had the symbol actually changed? I blinked and rubbed my eyes. The more I stared, the more I was convinced it was not the same. The pattern was growing, expanding slowly, imperceptibly at first, until it covered more of the floor. I couldn't just sit there. I had to figure out what was happening. I got up, my feet dragging across the cold floor as I approached the symbol. My breath hitched in my throat as I noticed something new, something far worse. The mark on the floor had begun to shimmer, just a little, as if it was alive. Pulsing. Like it was breathing. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I moved, I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. There was something hypnotic about the pattern, something drawing me closer, urging me to understand it, to figure out what it wanted from me. I shook my head. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. "This is just some weird trick of the light. It's nothing." But I wasn't so sure anymore. In the days that followed, the symbol continued to grow. Every night it would shift, new parts of it appearing, more lines, more curves, more intricate details, until the entire floor seemed to be consumed by it. The marks were not just lines anymore. They were shapes, figures that seemed almost human. And the worst part? Every time I woke up, I found myself closer to the symbol than I had been before. It was as though the floor was pulling me in. I couldn't stay in that room much longer. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but then I would hear the whispers. Low, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from beneath the floor. I couldn't understand the language, but I could feel the urgency in it. The need. The command to stay. My mind was unraveling. The room had become a prison. The whispers came more often now, especially when I tried to sleep. I'd wake up to find myself closer to the symbol, and with each passing night, it seemed to gain more control over me. It wasn't just the symbol anymore. It was everything around it, the walls, the floor, even the air seemed to bend and shift as though it was made of the same language, the same pattern. I was becoming part of it. The worst night came when I woke up to find that the symbol had reached the edge of the bed. The lines stretched up toward me, like fingers, clawing their way across the floor. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was something alive. Something hungry. And it wanted me. I lay in bed, frozen with terror, unable to move. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and I could feel my sanity slipping away, bit by bit. Something in the back of my mind told me that I was meant to finish the symbol, to add the final part, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. The next morning, the room was eerily silent. The floor was smooth, the symbol gone. The lines were barely visible, like they had never existed. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew it was still there, beneath the surface, waiting. And so, I left. I couldn't stay in that room. I couldn't stay in that hotel. I checked out and went on my way, but I knew, deep down, that it would follow me. The symbol, the language, the whispers, they would follow me wherever I went. Because the floor had marked me. And once it did, there was no escaping it. I didn't return to the hotel room, but somehow, it didn't feel like I had left. The air around me was heavy with the presence of something that wasn't just in the room, it was inside me, too. I thought I could forget about it. I thought I could leave that symbol behind and go back to my life. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mark was still there, lingering in my mind like a stain I couldn't wash away. For a while, I tried to push it out of my thoughts. I busied myself with work, tried to focus on everything that didn't remind me of that night. But it didn't help. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lines, the shapes, the way they moved and shifted, like something trying to break free. The whispers never stopped. They were faint, but they were there, calling to me in the quietest moments. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, I decided to go back to the hotel. Maybe it was because I thought I could confront it, close that chapter of my life. Maybe I was just desperate to find answers. I didn't know. But when I arrived, the hotel seemed different, as though it had changed in my absence. It wasn't the same room I had stayed in before, it couldn't have been. But the moment I walked through the door, it felt familiar. Like I was walking into a place I had already been, even though I knew I hadn't. The walls, the floor, the air, it was all wrong. I could feel the presence of the symbol beneath me, even though it wasn't visible. I had no words for what I felt. It was like being in the same room, but also being somewhere else entirely. I couldn't stop myself. I sat down on the bed and stared at the floor, expecting to see the pattern appear again, but it didn't. The floor remained blank, calm, almost serene. But then the whispers started. At first, they were soft, too soft to understand. Just the sound of the air moving, perhaps. But they grew louder, more insistent. They sounded like voices, but not in a language I could recognize. It was as though they were speaking through me, as if I wasn't meant to hear them, but they were being forced into my mind anyway. I closed my eyes, tried to block it out, but that only made it worse. The voices seemed to grow more distinct with every moment. They were calling to me, urging me to listen, to understand what they were saying. I could feel the pressure building inside me, my chest tightening with a fear I couldn't explain. The whispers weren't just words, they were commands. Please. Desperate cries for help. It felt like something was trying to break through, like the symbol I had left behind was finally coming to life, stretching beyond the floor, beyond the room. It was reaching for me, pulling me in, and I had no choice but to follow. The more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. The voices, no, the words, became clearer. I stumbled out of bed and onto the floor. My body seemed to move on its own, as if something else had taken control. The pattern appeared again beneath me, like it had been waiting, watching. It was faint at first, but as I knelt there, it grew stronger, more defined. The lines expanded, and I felt my mind racing, the fear almost suffocating. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if the room was changing around me. The whispers intensified. There was a voice now, clearer than all the rest. Finish it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to touch the symbol, didn't want to become part of whatever it was. But I knew I had no choice. I had to. The room was alive now, pulsing with the same rhythm as the symbol, the lines, the whispers. They were all part of the same thing. Part of something ancient. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and I touched the floor where the symbol had begun to fade. As soon as my skin met the surface, the world around me shifted. I felt the floor give way beneath me, the lines of the symbol taking shape in a way that was terrifyingly real. Something was moving beneath the floor. Not just the symbol, something more. Something alive. And then, as my hand made contact with the floor, the symbol seemed to explode outward, filling the room with a sharp, blinding light. I could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever before, chanting in unison, but they weren't words. They were a sound, a resonance, like something old and forgotten was waking up. The walls closed in around me, and for the first time, I realized I was trapped. Trapped in the room. Trapped in the symbol. Trapped in whatever force had been watching me all along. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls. The light grew brighter, more intense, and then I felt it, a presence, cold and vast, reaching toward me. The symbol wasn't just on the floor anymore. It was everywhere. The walls. The ceiling. The air. It had consumed the room. And then I understood. I had finished it. The symbol had been waiting for me to complete it. To set it free. But I wasn't sure if it was me who had finished it, or if it had finished me. The light took everything. And when it was gone, the room was silent again. I woke up to the quiet hum of the hotel's air conditioning, the sterile white walls of my room greeting me like nothing had changed. The bed beneath me felt too soft, like I had never left, but I knew I had, at least, that night. The heavy weight of the silence pressed against my ears, and I could feel the absence of the symbol beneath me. It was as though everything had returned to normal. but I knew better. I sat up slowly, the events of the previous night swirling in my head like fragments of a shattered mirror. My fingers brushed against my face, my neck, trying to ground myself, but the unease was unbearable. The fear that had gripped me so tightly seemed to have settled deep in my bones, lingering even after the chaos had passed. The room, despite its seeming normality, felt wrong. There was something fundamentally off about it, a subtle shift in the air, the texture of the walls, the lighting. The floor, now bare and pristine, showed no trace of the symbol, no sign of the strange designs that had appeared earlier. It was as though nothing had ever happened. Yet I knew it had. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, faint and far away, but present. I stumbled out of bed, my body moving as if it were detached from me. My feet met the cool floor, and I took a step toward the bathroom, desperate to wash away the feeling of rawness that clung to me. But before I could reach the door, something caught my eye. A faint shadow on the floor. It wasn't much, just a hint of a line that shouldn't have been there. A thin, pale streak, almost invisible in the dim light, stretching across the space beneath the bed. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. The symbol? It couldn't be. Not again. I approached the bed cautiously, my breath shallow. I knelt down, peering under the bed with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The line on the floor was still there, faint but undeniable. It looked like the beginning of a shape, something I couldn't fully comprehend. My hand trembled as I reached for the floor. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt compelled to touch it again, to finish what I had started. My fingers brushed the edge of the line, and the instant my skin made contact, a shock wave of energy surged through me, the same sensation as before, but more powerful, more immediate. The world around me blurred for a moment, and I thought I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, almost as if they were speaking to me directly. Finish it. I jerked my hand away, panic flooding my chest. What had I done? Why was I hearing it again? I had thought it was over. I had thought I was free. But the symbol wasn't done with me. It was waiting for me to make a choice I couldn't escape. I backed away from the bed, my body trembling with a cold sweat. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave this place, leave the symbol, leave whatever it was that had taken hold of me. But the door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't turn, no matter how hard I twisted it. It was as though the room itself had trapped me inside. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The room no longer felt like a room. It felt like a cage, a space held together by something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting for me to come back. The symbol, the whispers, the pressure, they were all part of it. The walls had been waiting for me to finish it. A soft scraping sound from behind me made me spin around. The floor, the symbol was moving. The lines were stretching, expanding, filling the room with a sense of urgency, a pulse that I could feel deep in my chest. No, I whispered, stepping back in horror. But it was too late. The symbol spread rapidly across the floor, covering every inch of space, every corner. It wasn't just on the floor anymore. It was in the walls, the ceiling. The air was thick with it. I could hear the whispers now, no longer faint but deafening, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, pulling me toward the center of the room. My body moved on its own, like a puppet on strings. I was being drawn into the center of the pattern, my feet dragging along the floor as if something was pulling me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My mouth opened, but the air around me was thick, suffocating. Help me, the whispers begged, their voices blending together into one desperate plea. Finish it. I had to make a choice. Either I could stay and let it consume me, or I could try to break free. But how? How could I stop something so powerful, so relentless? How could I fight against something that was already inside me, in my mind, in my soul? I turned and ran. I ran toward the door, pounding on the handle, trying to force it open. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred, but the door remained stubbornly closed. The symbol had claimed the room. It had claimed me. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape it. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way, a loud crack splitting the silence. I fell, and everything went black. When I woke again, I wasn't in the hotel. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in strange markings. I could feel it again, the pull of the symbol. The whispers had followed me. They were everywhere. I was still in the room, still trapped in the pattern, still unfinished. And now, it was time to finish what I had started. I couldn't move. I lay there, pinned to the floor, my body rigid with fear, but it wasn't my body that controlled me now. The symbol. It had a hold of me. The floor beneath me felt like it was alive, pulsing with a rhythm I couldn't ignore, like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. I could feel the whispers surrounding me, closing in, as if the very air was vibrating with their voices. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. They had stolen my voice, just like they had stolen everything else. The walls around me were no longer just walls. They had become a part of the pattern, a living, breathing extension of the symbol. The markings on the floor were now etched into the walls, twisting and writhing in ways that made my stomach churn. The ceiling seemed to pulse with the same unnatural energy. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a prison, and I was its prisoner. The whispers had become clearer, louder. I could make out words now, though they weren't in any language I recognized. The syllables twisted and turned in strange, dissonant patterns, but I understood the meaning. It was a command. A demand. Finish it, they whispered, over and over, each time growing more urgent. Complete the cycle. The pressure in my chest grew stronger, as if the very air was crushing me. I tried to push myself up, but my arms and legs felt like they were made of lead. The floor seemed to pull me back, dragging me down deeper into its grip. The symbol was everywhere, suffocating me, drowning me in its presence. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the sound, but the whispers followed me. They were inside my head now, clawing at my thoughts, twisting my mind. There was no escaping them. No escape from the pattern. No escape from whatever had summoned me here. The walls were closing in. I could feel them tightening, pressing down on me. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was losing myself in the pattern, becoming a part of it. A part of something ancient, something evil. The floor beneath me shifted again, and I felt a jolt, as if the very foundations of the building were cracking. My vision blurred as the room around me twisted, the lines of the symbol stretching and shifting, becoming more complex, more elaborate. It was as if it was alive, growing, feeding off of my fear. And the whispers, they were getting louder, faster, more desperate. Finish it, they chanted. Complete the cycle. I had to do something. I had to fight back. I couldn't let this take me. I couldn't let it consume me. But what could I do? How could I fight against something that had already infiltrated my mind? Something that had already taken root in my soul? And then I remembered. The mirror. The one I had seen in the hotel lobby, the one that had felt wrong. Had it been a sign? A warning? What if it was the key to breaking the pattern? I had to try. I had to escape before it was too late. With all my remaining strength, I managed to lift my head. The room spun around me, but I forced my eyes to focus. I saw the mirror, standing against the far wall, its surface gleaming in the dim light. It had been waiting. It had always been waiting. I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling toward the mirror, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, but I couldn't stop now. I had to reach it. I had to make it stop. As I reached the mirror, I hesitated. What would happen if I touched it? Would it stop the pattern? Would it break the cycle? I had no answers, no certainty. But I couldn't stand there and do nothing. Now I could feel the pattern closing in, tightening around me like a vice. I placed my hand on the mirror's cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The whispers faltered, just for a second, and I thought maybe it was working. But then, the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The surface warped, the reflection twisting and distorting. The symbol on the floor seemed to stretch toward it, as if it were reaching for the mirror. The air grew colder. The whispers grew louder. Suddenly, the mirror shattered. But it wasn't glass that fell to the floor. It was pieces of the symbol. They scattered across the room like fragments of a broken puzzle, each shard catching the dim light in a strange, eerie glow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had broken the mirror. But in that moment, I realized my mistake. The room hadn't stopped. It was still alive, still pulsing with the symbol, the whispers now turned into screams. The pieces of the symbol on the floor began to move, assembling themselves into something bigger, something more terrifying. I could feel the air around me thickening, closing in, like the walls were swallowing me whole. The floor beneath me cracked open, and I fell deeper into the darkness, deeper into the pattern. The whispers were now screams, and the symbol had become a part of me, a part of my very being. And I knew then, with terrifying clarity, that I would never escape. The cycle had begun, and it would never end. The darkness swallowed me whole. It felt like I was falling, endlessly, deeper into something that had no end. The coldness surrounded me, pressing in from all sides. The walls, no, the ground beneath me, seemed to stretch away, bending and shifting like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the walls began. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. I was floating, drifting in a void, but the whispers, they were still there. The symbol, it was everywhere. In my mind, in my body, in the very air I breathed. The whispers, once distant, were now a constant hum, like 1,000 voices trapped in my skull. They weren't words anymore, but feelings, memories, fragments of something ancient, something that had been waiting for me to complete it. I could hear them, calling to me, urging me to finish what I had started. Complete it. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, my body numb. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The only thing I could feel was the symbol, the pulse, the rhythm, the life of it, thrumming inside me, outside me. It was inside my mind, weaving itself into every thought, every breath. It was a part of me now. I tried to close my eyes to escape it, but even in the dark, I could see it, twisted, grotesque, the lines of the symbol creeping along the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was alive. It had always been alive, and now it was part of me. I couldn't escape. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I wasn't alone in this void. There was something with me, something that had always been here, something waiting for me to finish the cycle. I could feel its presence, a shadow just beyond my vision, its eyes on me, its breath on my neck. The symbol, it wasn't just a design. It wasn't just an image. It was a door. A doorway to something beyond, something that had been waiting for me to open it. And now, I had done it. I had opened it. The walls around me shifted again, and I felt myself being pulled. The symbol, it was pulling me in, twisting my body, warping my mind. I couldn't resist. I had no choice. The ground beneath me cracked open, revealing a deep, infinite chasm. I felt myself falling, plummeting into the abyss. The whispering voices screamed in unison, louder than ever, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that this was it. This was the end. I had become a part of the symbol, a part of the cycle. I had become nothing. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.